The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 126. The Stubborn Quail. The turn of the parade made the soldiers on the street heave a sigh of relief and throw their hats into the air, as if they had just won a war. The Duke of Wellington himself also breathed a sigh of relief. He had killed too many people in his life, and he really didn't want to be stained with the blood of his compatriots in his later years. However, Palmerston was not happy at all, because although this group of people left, the petitions were still there, and these damn workers might still make the secrets of his Sassoon family public. Mr. Duke, I heard that you defeated Napoleon. Why don't you dare to pursue these damn gangsters and beggars? Why? The Duke of Wellington replied with a smile. Boys, I'm here today. The Duke of Wellington shouted. Treating a guest with a superior is a matter worthy of celebration for soldiers from all countries, both ancient and modern, at home and abroad. Hail, sir. An officer suddenly shouted, who ran after Sir Towelhouse. The already noisy soldiers chanted, it's our Iron Duke, who drove Marmont out of Spain. It's our Iron Duke, who kicked Bonaparte in the ass at Waterloo. It's our Iron Duke, who's going to pay for us tonight. It's our Iron Duke. The Iron Duke turned to look at Palmerston. That's why. Do you want to come together? Palmerston could only sigh helplessly. The Iron Duke Wellington had unparalleled influence in Britain at this time. Many generals regarded him as an idol. Both soldiers and civilians had heard of his story. If Napoleon was the great devil, then the Iron Duke was the one who defeated the devil. Brave. This time the army was really rejoicing. Not only the soldiers, but also the officers were equally happy. Countless hats were thrown into the sky again, and they even sang the March of the Grenadiers. The old Duke looked at the soldiers singing Grenadier March in front of him, and he seemed to have returned to the smoke-filled battlefield. He still remembered his friends dying on the battlefield one by one. After each battle, when he walked on the muddy battlefield, it seemed as if he was stepping on the flesh and blood of the soldiers. However, before the Iron Duke's memories ended, someone discovered a more serious problem. The parade seemed to be heading towards Buckingham Palace. Palmerston was a little confused. There have always been Republicans in Britain who hoped to directly kill Queen Victoria and completely overthrow the monarchy and realize a republic. But with such a huge team and such a huge momentum, if the Queen is really sent to the guillotine, Britain's international reputation will not be lost. The most important thing is that he doesn't like French democracy at all. It's too crazy and too bloody. Palmerston looked at the Iron Duke Wellington, who also realized the seriousness of the problem. If the parade really stormed Buckingham Palace, wouldn't he? Wellington felt his vision go dark and almost fell off his horse. The adjutant on the side saw this and quickly supported him. Your Majesty, what should we do now? Don't help me. Chase quickly. We must get to Buckingham Palace before the parade. The Iron Duke took the lead, and the officers behind him also looked in a hurry, and the soldiers behind them also realized the seriousness of the problem and followed closely behind. London, Buckingham Palace. Queen Victoria was not yet a heavy tank, although she was jokingly called a stubborn and willful quail by her later husband, Prince Albert. It is undeniable that Queen Victoria at this time had a kind of yang and coquettishness unique to a girl. The Queen was lying on the bed in her pajamas, writing a love poem to her Prime Minister, Viscount Melbourne. Although her English was poor, she still hoped that her love poem could impress this charming middle-aged uncle. From the moment Queen Victoria ascended the throne, she hoped to quickly become familiar with everything related to her identity. Prime Minister William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, was the best teacher. He carefully guided the Queen in handling government affairs. Viscount Melbourne's attentiveness made Victoria intoxicated, and she felt that she was in love. Queen Victoria's willfulness and arrogance often made Viscount Melbourne feel very embarrassed, but overall the Queen was a good student and a good boss. Since the Viscount of Melbourne belonged to the Whig Party, the Queen had extra trust in the entire Whig Party. So much so that a senior member of the Whig Party proposed that the Viscount of Melbourne cheer up and completely defeat the Tories. Viscount Melbourne, who was 58 years old, naturally declined the offer. However, the Queen only favoured the Whigs, which made the Tories unhappy. Robert Peel even claimed that the Viscount of Melbourne had an affair with the Queen. This did not scare Victoria, but made her even closer to the Whigs. The noise outside the window disturbed Victoria's mood. She sat up from the bed and rang the bell, and a servant came in immediately. "Your Majesty, what are your orders? What's going on outside? It's so noisy," Victoria asked Her Majesty the Queen. Outside. Seeing the maid hesitating, Victoria became even more curious, so she decided to go to the window to have a look. As a result, he saw an endless procession approaching Buckingham Palace. The cavalry on the road tried to drive the crowd away, but the procession did not stop. The army had surrounded Buckingham Palace. Some officers entered Buckingham Palace with a message from the Iron Duke, hoping that the Queen could leave temporarily. As for the parade crowd, they would find a way. Victoria rejected the Iron Duke's offer. "Tell the Duke of Wellington that I'm the Queen of England and I will not leave my palace." Victoria's answer surprised the officer. He really couldn't think of any illness that caused Her Majesty to lose her temper at this time. "Your Majesty, this is very dangerous. Please stay away. This is the Duke's advice." The officer emphasized again. "Where is the Prime Minister of Melbourne? I want to see the Prime Minister of Melbourne at this time." Shouts came from outside the window. "We want butter. We want bread. Your Majesty, please think twice. The mob is outside and may rush in at any time." The officer pleaded. "Sir, what is your name?" "Your Majesty, my name is William Elliot." The officer replied. "Mr. Elliot, please stay outside. I have to change." Victoria said. The maid on the side invited Mr. Elliot out and immediately began to change Queen Victoria's clothes. Of course, Queen Victoria has heard the story of Louis XVI. Although she did nothing wrong, she may follow in the footsteps of Louis XVI today. She is not afraid of death, but is afraid that her death will not be beautiful enough. The teenage girl put on her clothes stubbornly, picked up the scepter that symbolized the power of the British royal family, and walked to the balcony. The moment Queen Victoria appeared, the noise stopped, and both the soldiers and the workers on the parade stared at Queen Victoria on the balcony and held their breath. Queen Victoria on the balcony looked at the crowded ocean below, turned her palms inward, and revealed the letter written to her by the mysterious man. "There will be bread. There will be butter. Everything will be fine. Thank you. It is you who have made Britain strong. Without you, there would be no Britain today. I, the Queen of England, Victoria, hereby swear that I will protect you. Have the rights and property you deserve. God save the Queen." The crowd gathered in front of Buckingham Palace sang the British national anthem "God Save the Queen" in unison. Even the soldiers confronting the crowd also sang the national anthem with the crowd. The Viscount of Melbourne, who came in a hurry, saw this scene and couldn't help but burst into tears. "Sorry for such a hasty ending. This topic is too sensitive, and I don't want all the months of hard work to go to waste. I will write something else later, and I ask for your support. As for why there is an English paragraph, it's not that I want water, but mainly that English looks more interesting." Chapter 127 Sciterii, Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz read the news in the newspaper. The Queen of England announced the implementation of a 12-hour working day and required factory owners to improve workers' treatment. In fact, this is a good thing for the future of Britain at any time, but in Britain, which has just experienced an economic crisis, this will undoubtedly greatly intensify domestic conflicts. There was an uproar in the British Parliament, and a day later several MPs had to undergo bloodletting due to elevated blood pressure. Viscount Melbourne, the leader of the Whig Party, and Robert Peel, the leader of the Tory Party, both locked themselves in small dark rooms, as if waiting for the end to come. Queen Victoria was a little proud of the roaring cheers before. What she didn't know was that the whole of Britain was now in chaos. If a factory owner takes the lead in openly opposing the Queen's policies, of course he will be immediately beaten up by workers coming from all directions, while the military police look on and don't know what to do. Some people tried to launch an uprising to overthrow the monarchy. However, they underestimated the British military power at this time. These soldiers may hesitate to hit civilians, but they are unambiguous in attacking the rebels. After all, robbery is the biggest source of income for soldiers. Archduke Franz, Archbishop Prussia wants to see you. A Jenny reminded Franz from the side point. Archbishop Prussia had just entered Franz's study when a cool breeze blew by, instantly making him shiver. Praise God, only God's power can create such a miracle. Yes, God has given us wisdom so that we can spend this difficult summer cool. Franz instantly possessed the magic stick and cooperated with Archbishop Prussia and said, when he saw the report in Russia's hand, he couldn't help but sigh that he still underestimated the power of the church and underestimated the armed merchant ships. The armed merchant ship in Franz's imagination had a displacement of 1 to 200 tons and was fully loaded with cargo. When several sailors saw the pirates, they panicked and couldn't fight or run away. After surrendering, they could only jump on sampans one after another and be fed to sharks by pirates. In fact, the armed merchant ships at this time often weighed 2,000 tons and more than 60 cannons, which could almost be used as capital ships. They had hundreds of sailors, including a considerable number of retired navy, and the rest were desperados. Sink it and hang the pirate captain's head on the mast of the ship's bow. Large cargo ships at sea during this period could not be insured without artillery. For example, the famous Great Eastern was equipped with a standard 74 battleship point at this time. In order to support Kampong Sun, the Austrian church actually assembled 10 such large armed merchant ships, 600 fighting brothers, as well as various craftsmen, doctors, and volunteers, a total of 2,000 people. Archbishop Prussia was originally going to send some mercenaries over, but was stopped by Franz, because mercenaries are like double-edged swords. They fight fiercely, and it is convenient to just throw them away if they are dead or injured. However, these people are also good at destroying things, and are very likely to destroy the credibility of the church in a short time. There are also counterattacks. Possibility of water. If you want to completely naturalize a place, it is best not to use mercenaries. It's just that everything in Chenla did not develop according to Franz's plan. First, the Chenla people's uprising spread to Ambrosius, and then Friedrich refused to provide support. The military only wanted to sell arms and refused to intervene. Of course, I also know that Chenla is too far away from Austria, and supplies on the road are problematic, and the direct benefits that the Austrian Empire can obtain from Chenla are too few. At this time, Franz's political influence was almost zero. Although Archbishop Prussia's status was not low, after the 30 Years' War, the church withdrew from the Austrian political stage and became completely an accessory of the royal family. However, now Franz can only use the power of the church. Of course, Archbishop Prussia is happy that Franz can use the power of the church to do something, and he is also willing to serve Franz. Franz's original plan was to take the upper level route and then let the military step in. Now he can only rely on religion to win. Chenla, Kampong Som Bay. Kampong Som was originally a small fishing village with a few hundred people. By 1836, it had developed into a city with more than 10,000 parishioners and 800 sciterii. Coupled with the surrounding controlled villages, the total population in the jurisdiction can reach 20,000. In fact, there were only more than 600 white people in Kampong Som at this time, the vast majority of whom were Austrians, and some were Catholic volunteers from other countries. The legal system continued the civil code of the Austrian Empire, based on the actual local conditions, and adopted a tolerance policy for many customs, such as paganism and polygamy. First, the armed missionaries eliminated the bandits that were harming the local area, and then stopped the exploitation by the local government. Although the Austrian church also collected taxes, compared with the exploitation of Chenla officials, the church's tithes were too light. At this time, the Chenla people in the area had long regarded themselves as God's people, and they all chose to stay and become Austrians. Franz used religion to artificially create a class in Kampong Sun. That is, the parishioners enjoyed many privileges, but correspondingly they also had to bear more obligations, such as learning German, defending the country, paying tithes, etc. The outstanding ones among them can become clergy and state civil servants. Non-believers in Kampong Som do not have to pay tithes, but they have to pay national taxes. Although there are no exorbitant taxes and miscellaneous taxes in Chinla in the past, the national taxes are still higher than the tithes. In addition, those who are not religious and do not know German are not allowed to serve as officials. This system of integrating politics and religion is very suitable for backward areas. Of course, this is also to win over the Catholics and let them invest more efforts in this parish. The first battle of the Kampong Som Skiterii was against the Zenla and puppet troops who were chasing Guan Jinping. When Guan Jinping escaped from the Xiangshan mountains with the remaining 5,000 people, the Zenla and puppet troops who were chasing them actually only had 4,000 people. However, in order to survive, Guan Jinping and others had to flee everywhere. When they encountered the Skiterii, they found that there were only 800 people there. They planned to take advantage of the battle between the Skiterii and the Chenla puppet army to flee to Kampong Som Bay and rob the ship, crossed the sea, and escaped from Chinla Point. However, there was still a team of the Austrian church behind the Skiterii. Originally, Guan Jinping planned to lead his men to force a breakthrough, but the cannon fired and suppressed them. At the same time, the Zenla puppet army in front also launched an attack on the Skiterii. After more than a year of training, these Zenla fishermen were no longer afraid of the Zenla official soldiers whose weapons were not as good as those of the bandits. Every Skiterii, if they want to be recognized, must participate in 5 battles to eliminate bandits. At this time, the Zenla officers and soldiers coming like a tide are not worth fearing. In their eyes, the Zenla and puppet troops were approaching little by little, but the soldiers of the Skiterii did not fire, but were waiting for the commander's order. The Austrian officers were waiting for the other party to enter the range of the artillery. With the sound of several cannons, large iron balls exploded on the heads of the Zenla and puppet soldiers. Countless small steel balls in the shotguns were shot at the surrounding crowd. Instantly a position was cleared. Before these Zenla puppet troops could react, the Skiterii also opened fire. 3 consecutive rounds of shooting knocked the still living Zenla puppet troops into disarray. Just when they were looking for their commanders and waiting for orders, the Skiterii rushed out of the black smoke caused by the muskets and stabbed them with sharp bayonets. To those helpless Zenla puppet troops, the battle did not last long. Of the 4,000 Chenla and puppet troops, 1,500 were killed on the spot. There were more than 1,000 wounded, 1,300 were captured, and more than 100 people managed to escape. Chapter 128 Post-War Processing. Zenla, £Sun. 1 month before this battle, Guan Jinping and others learned of the Vietnamese's extermination order and wanted to launch an uprising in order to survive, but they were reported by a traitor. The Vietnamese sent 20,000 troops. After a day of fighting with the Chenla rebel army, they fled Phnom Penh with their families. Although the number of rebels was only 6,000, the number of fleeing troops was tens of thousands. There is nothing we can do about this, because apart from those big-headed soldiers, every official has dozens or hundreds of people in his family. As for wealthy families like the Guanjin family and the Pala family, there are thousands of people, not including domestic slaves. Such a team would definitely not be able to run fast at first. The Vietnamese officers and soldiers chased them all the way and captured countless treasures and baggage. The captured men could be exchanged for rewards, and the women could be sold as slaves. Slavery was still prevalent in Vietnam at this time. However, there is a saying that, when the enemy is poor, do not pursue it. The rebels fled into a hilly area called Dead Man's Mountain, where they had prepared food and weapons in advance, so the rebels began to use the terrain to ambush the pursuing Vietnamese army. The rebels' weapons were inherently more advanced than those of the Vietnamese army, and the rainforest terrain was naturally suitable for ambushes. After several battles, they actually defeated the Vietnamese army, which was unfamiliar with the terrain. At this time, the Vietnamese army is a large barracks. Within the Vietnamese army, whoever has more soldiers has the right to speak. The Vietnamese general who leads the troops naturally understands this truth, so he does not want to waste too much of his own strength. So he sent the Khmer spies Ren Yu and Luo Jian, who had surrendered to Vietnam, to personally lead the troops to hunt down the rebels. The 2 Khmer spies knew the rules of jungle warfare, so they set fire to the mountain. Guan Jinping and others could only escape in embarrassment. Afterwards, 2 Khmer spies led their own puppet troops to hunt down Guan Jinping and others. However, the Vietnamese did not actually trust Ren Yu and Luo Jian, and only gave them 4,000 men and some matchlock guns. The main weapons were still broadswords and spears. Archers actually need long-term training, and temporarily recruited armies rarely use this kind of thing. As for projectiles, project one in the jungle terrain to see if the opponent is shot to death by you first, or is killed by you first. Laughing to death, although the Zenla puppet army once fought with the Vietnamese and was defeated in one blow, now they are not merciless at all when killing the Zenla people. Guan Jinping and others ran for their lives without any care. Peresu even abandoned his great-granddaughter in the mountains and left her to fend for herself. Of course, Peresu himself did not make it out of the Xiangshan mountains alive in the end. In this way, the original team of nearly 30,000 people was reduced to less than 5,000 people when they escaped from the Xiangshan mountains, leading to the previous scene. The Zenla puppet army who came after them first betrayed Zenla and joined the Vietnamese. They chased Guan Jinping and others all the way to Kampong Som. They were already red-blooded. With the mountains behind them, they had no choice but to retreat. Ren Yu and Luo Jian often compared themselves to Han Chengqiao and Fan Wencheng. They imagined that in the future, after Chenla became the territory of David, they would also be officials of David, and they would definitely show off their talents in David. As a result, the Zenla puppet army led by Renai and Luo Jian attacked the Skateriai's position. In their minds, the weapons of the Western Yu were just large firecrackers, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Everything went smoothly at first. Those Zenla people wearing ZIE military uniforms seemed to be frightened. However, at a distance of 150 meters, there was a sudden sound of artillery. A cannonball exploded directly in front of Renayu, and countless small steel balls shot out of it. He flew out and beat him into a sieve on the spot. Seeing Renayu's tragic death, Luo Jian was not afraid of rejoicing and urged the soldiers forward. Then gunshots burst out, and a burst of blood mist exploded from Luo Jian's shoulder and he fell to the ground. The surrounding soldiers tried to help the commander up, but gunshots started again, and most of the soldiers who stepped forward were knocked to the ground. Afterwards, the confused soldiers anxiously looked for their commander. Gunfire broke out again, and another group of soldiers fell down. At this time, the Zenla and puppet troops rushing at the front had been basically wiped out, and those behind had just arrived and didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a group of Chenla people wearing Western-style military uniforms rushed out from the black smoke. Some of the leaderless Chenla puppet troops wanted to resist, while others wanted to surrender. They fought on their own and were quickly killed and defeated. 1/3 of the dead Zenla puppet troops were killed by artillery fire and bullets, and most of the rest were stabbed to death with bayonets, and some were trampled to death. In fact, at the moment when the Skateriai rushed out of the black smoke and launched a bayonet charge, many Zenla puppet troops were already ready to surrender. However, these Skateriai have been influenced by religious ideas for a long time and have become somewhat extreme. When facing pagans, even if the other party surrenders, they have no intention of stopping and will stab every living person twice. First point, and the most incredible thing is that the surrendered Zenla puppet troops seemed to be used to the killing of prisoners in front of them. They were completely indifferent and just knelt down and waited. The soldiers of the Skateriai stabbed their chests with bayonets without knowing. Resist. Finally, an Austrian army officer stopped the massacre of the Skateriai. This officer is not a saint, but the construction of Kampong Som really needs manpower at this time. Kampong Som was no longer a small fishing village, and all aspects of construction required labor. In fact, these Skateriai are also very strange. They never take prisoners when dealing with bandits, and gentry armed forces. Why did the commander ask them to stop and take prisoners this time? However, these Skateriai did not care about this, leaving some to collect the prisoners, while others continued to hunt down the fleeing Zenla puppet troops. In the end, except for a small number of Zenla puppet troops, they fled into the mountains, and the wounded soldiers and prisoners were gathered together. The captives of the Chenla puppet army and the wounded soldiers who were not seriously injured and could still work were asked to dig a big pit and throw their bodies into the pit. After that, part of the Skateriai was responsible for escorting the prisoners back to the camp and taking away the wounded and dead. The remaining Skateriai gathered the wounded of the Zenla and puppet troops together and sent 2 priests to the wounded soldiers. We pray. Those Chenla and puppet soldiers are very familiar with this. These foreign monks will most likely be like the monks in the temple, persuading them to put down their butcher knives and become Buddhas on the spot. These Zendler and puppet soldiers immediately became arrogant, and they were all wondering whether they would have to deal with these foreign monks before leaving. There were even some injured people yelling, "Treat me quickly. Why are you chanting a curse? If I die, I will curse you to the 18th level of hell." However, after a simple prayer, the priests left, replaced by the somewhat ferocious looking Skaterii. The soldiers of the Skaterii used bayonets to drive away the wounded of the Zendler puppet army and forced them into a large pit filled with dead people. At this time, the wounded of the puppet army finally came to their senses and someone shouted, "I can work. I'm not injured. I don't want to die." However, the surrounding Skaterii paid no attention to the shouts in the pit and just poured the kerosene into the pit expressionlessly. The fire burned for 4 hours, and while the fire was extinguished, the Skaterii began to talk. "Don't we usually just kill everyone? Why are we in so much trouble today?" Another small leader of the Skaterii lit up a cigarette, took 2 puffs and said, "There are not enough manpower, and the priests are opposed to letting the parishioners work as coolies, but someone has to do the work, so the chiefs want to capture some prisoners to work as coolies." The little boss from before grabbed the cigarette and took 2 puffs and said, "There are so many things to do. Building a house is considered hard work. I used to not be able to have a full meal every day. Not only did I have to work for my own family every day, but I also had to work at my master's house." How fucking hypocritical. Didn't you hear what the priests said? "We are God's chosen people, and our enemies must be the abandoned people. Isn't it good to let those abandoned people do hard labor?" What? Voters? I spent the first half of my life working as a cow or a horse, eating pig food, and living in a stable. Where did they go at that time? But what about you now? Han Chia Chang, you now live in the house of the former landlord and have 3 wives. What else are you dissatisfied with? Satisfied? It's a joke. One day I will kill all these foreign monks, and it will be great to be the boss. In the evening the flames finally extinguished, and the Skaterii soldiers sprinkled the bodies with white ash and then buried them with earth. The priests said that lime powder can completely purify evil souls and prevent them from turning into evil spirits and continuing to harm the world. This is the word of the saints. The soldiers of the Skaterii firmly believe in this and do it very carefully. The so-called saint naturally refers to Franz. The reason why Franz had such worries was naturally because he knew the severity of the epidemic. Of course, it was also because 26 people in Austria died in Chenla in 2 years, 20 of whom died from the epidemic. In fact, this was done to prevent incomplete burning and the spread of disease after the corpses decomposed. The climate in Southeast Asia is hot and humid, making it extremely difficult to control an epidemic once it occurs, especially in this era. The means and drugs to control epidemics are very scarce, so the best prevention and treatment method is to prevent it from happening. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 129. Fire and water are ruthless. In Europe, a strong convective weather visited here, and the typhoon also arrived as expected. Typhoons and strong convective weather brought heavy rains, which directly caused flash floods in northern Spain. The flash floods caused by heavy rains almost ended the Carlist War early. A flash flood destroyed the Carlist camp, and many senior officers were buried forever under the soil in their sleep. Carlos and his children were also almost swallowed by the flash flood, but fortunately the royal mule woke him up in time and took them to safe high ground. The royal mule refers to Carlos's mount. Since Carlos was not good at walking on mountain roads, he was carried by a guide every time he marched, so he was also called the royal mule. This rare heavy rain even overturned to British supply ships, and the Carolist supply may be tight. Of course, this was not good news for the Queen Regent, because the floods washed away river embankments and bridges, creating large floodplains, and the march of the Spanish government troops was greatly slowed down. A large amount of farmland in southern France was flooded. The Moselle, Marne, Seine, Lot, Dordogne, Garonne, and Saône rivers all flooded. Hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland were flooded, and tens of thousands of people were injured. Homeless, hundreds of people died directly from the floods. Important cities such as Lyon and Paris have suffered varying degrees of damage. French grapes have suffered the most serious losses. It is expected that the price of French wine will increase by 30% next year. The grapes in France were first dried into raisins by the high temperature and then washed away without a trace by a flood. The vineyard owners were really in tears. If they had known better, they would have sold the raisins directly. Severe thunderstorms hit Rotterdam, causing port fires in Austria. Rivers that have been dry for a long time suddenly experienced heavy rains. The result of the surge in water levels was massive floods. Austria is a country with a dense network of rivers, which disperses the destructive power of floods to a certain extent, but on the other hand strengthens the impact of floods. Other countries are experiencing flooding in some areas, but in Austria, flooding is occurring all over the country. The Austrians followed the traditional practice of directly introducing floods into the Danube River. And then Vienna was flooded. Almost all the streets were engulfed by floods, and the slums were completely submerged. Although the Austrian official only admitted that 200 people were killed, people continued to float out of the slums. The floating corpses like a ruthless hand slapping the Austrian government in the face. Franz came to the Vienna Women's College under the Karen Mountain. He hoped that Dobler and the scientists here could move to the city of Vienna. Because the continuous heavy rains had made the suburbs of Vienna unsafe, he did not want to suddenly ruin a group of top Austrian scientists at this time. However, they rejected Franz's proposal and expressed their intention to live or die with the laboratory. Although Franz didn't know what was in the laboratory, he still admired their research spirit of risking life and death. In fact, there is a reason why these professors are reluctant to leave. It is still the same old problem. In this era, you usually have to spend your own money to conduct research. After finally finding Franz, the professors really don't want to give up their hard-won experiment room. These people were conducting various kinds of research in the laboratory that Franz didn't know yet, but most of them were useless. Some people want to prove the existence of God, and some people want to develop glasses that can not only allow themselves to see clearly, but also blind other people's glasses, of course. There are also some relatively reliable studies. For example, an Austrian physicist is preparing to develop an aircraft. In order to make this aircraft fly into the sky, he built a super large slingshot, and the aircraft he designed is actually a flying saucer. At this time, a large number of utopian and autistic scholars gathered in Austria, and those gathered here were undoubtedly the leaders among them. Doppler said he would show Franz his latest research results, which excited Franz, because Doppler actually mentioned the site, which is a battlefield artifact. If all Austrian troops can be equipped with sights, however, when Franz saw the real thing, his jaw dropped, and he was not excited at all. The scope in front of me is more like a telescope than a scope. It is actually 800mm long. Not only does it increase in weight, it is also inconvenient to load and carry. Although it can indeed improve the hit rate, the practicality of this thing is too poor, and it is really not conducive to use by snipers. After that, Franz tried several more times, trying to make the scope smaller according to the modern design, but it didn't seem to be as simple as Franz thought, and the thing couldn't change the focal length. So it was really practical. It's limited. Maybe it will be better after long-term practice and increased proficiency. Franz could only give Doubler some advice. After all, he knew very little about this kind of thing. First of all, it should have a zoom function to facilitate snipers to kill enemies at various distances. Secondly, the sight distance should not be too far. Just 4 to 8 times is enough. No matter how far it is, there are no special firearms to support it. Then try not to make it too long, easy to carry and disassemble, and finally don't reflect light. As for the specific research, let's leave it to Mr. Doubler and those professionals. Based on Franz's air conditioning design, Doppler's team easily designed a cheap alternative that not only had good performance, but was only 35 times cheaper than the original one. After all, Franz only knew the general theory. made many wrong attempts, and hired craftsmen, etc., and the many expenses combined led to the high price of 70,000 florins. For example, the latest hand-operated refrigerator in the UK costs only £50, but its price is as high as £5,000 each. The first user of Franz's air conditioner was naturally the church. After Archbishop Prussia saw it once in Franz's study, he was full of praise for it. So Franz gave one to Archbishop Prussia, which led to more people praying every day in the church. In fact, except for the extreme weather this year, air conditioning is not of great value in Austria, except for churches. This kind of place is actually very suitable for air conditioning. As long as some noise is reduced, the coolness can make the church look more quiet and mysterious. The weather in Southeast Asia is so hot that Archbishop Prussia originally planned to buy 4 refrigeration machines for Kampong Sun for emergency use. At this time, he replaced them with Franz air conditioners. The price remained unchanged at 50,000 florins each, and 4 refrigeration machines were included. A Franz replica refrigeration machine. With such generous terms, Archbishop Prussia naturally had no reason to refuse, so he readily agreed. When these air conditioners traveled across the sea to Kampong Sun, the Austrians suddenly discovered a huge problem. That is, there was very little coal here, and sometimes they had to use wood and weeds as fuel. But the moment the cool breeze blows out, oh my god, this is truly the greatest creation in the world. How can there be such a sacred gas? Due to the limited number of air conditioners, it was impossible to use them for personal use. In addition, there were a large number of believers here, so all 4 air conditioners were simply installed in the church. Local officials and church leaders moved directly into the church. Chapter 130. The Troubles of the Tsar. This sudden heavy rain caused heavy losses to Austria, but Prussia did not take advantage. The Elbe River overflowed and submerged several towns. Prussian agriculture may have suffered heavy losses this year. The drought coupled with the current floods in some areas, even there may be no harvest. The flood rushed through Vienna and went straight downstream, which was very painful for the Hungarians. Although the Hungarians opened the sluices immediately, the flood directly destroyed the river embankments on both sides and changed the flow direction on the Hungarian. Serbia downstream of Hungary also suffered heavy losses, and the Danube River basin was wailing. The worst disaster in Eastern Europe is Poland. Since many cities in Poland are built along rivers, this flood destroyed many cities. The Russians, on the other hand, had a nonchalant attitude, and were even prepared to raise taxes and completely eliminate the Polish nobility. This natural disaster helped the Russians a lot. It not only weakened the power of the Polish nobles, but also made a lot of money. The Poles, French, and Prussians were all waiting for Russian food. The drought and floods of 1838 had very little impact on Russia. The only thing that Tsar was worried about now was his eldest son, Alexander. Alexander liked to flirt with women everywhere, and his reputation for being careless had spread throughout Europe, and Nicholas I felt deeply powerless about it. Alexander recently arrived in the UK, and as soon as he arrived in the UK, he saw crowds of people celebrating on the pier. At first Alexander thought it was a welcoming ceremony held by the British, but it was actually the dock workers celebrating. The Queen had promised the people that working hours would be limited and any form of overtime would be paid double. Alexander immediately stated that if he waited for him to ascend the throne, he would also implement a 12-hour work system. Alexander expressed his love for Victoria when he first met her. In fact, the two were of the same age, and he was only 1 year older than Victoria. Alexander's absurd behavior did not arouse Victoria's dissatisfaction, but the Queen praised him for his humor. The British officials were so frightened that they must not let these two random guys get together, otherwise Britain would be doomed. Word of Alexander's crazy behavior soon reached St. Petersburg, and so Nicholas I requested that Alexander be brought back to Russia to avoid further embarrassment. When the St. Petersburg envoy arrived in London, Alexander tied the Tsar's envoy and his chamberlain together and threw them into the Thames, causing the latter to resign in anger. However, Alexander's absurd journey was not over yet. When he met Queen Victoria again, Alexander directly broke a red rose in the Queen's garden and used it to propose to the Queen. The handsome and aggressive prince always easily captures the hearts of young girls, even for the Queen of England. who has just turned 19. Just when sparks were about to fly between the two, British officials and Alexander's entourage stopped everything. In fact, some British officials are quite supportive of the combination of the Queen and Alexander, which would make it possible to unite the two most powerful countries in the world, and avoid war if Britain, which has the strongest fleet in the world, and Russia, which has the strongest army in the world, unite. They will be invincible. However, most officials were worried about whether the Tsar would kill people indiscriminately. I heard that the Tsar liked to eat brains, especially those of Jews. British officials with Jewish ancestry expressed their uneasiness. Moreover, the Tsar had too much power. Will they let him go? Is Britain's constitutional government in ruins? Although British officials did not know whether the Tsar liked cannibalism, they knew very well that the Tsar would kill people. In fact, the conflict between two world hegemons cannot be resolved by marriage. It can only be achieved by one party defeating the other, or by dividing the sphere of influence and implementing a short-term peace. Victoria rejected Alexander, but Alexander was not discouraged. He rode horses, hunted, and danced with the Queen every day. Victoria also enjoys this feeling of being pursued, which is at least happier than her pursuing others. The two often hang out on the dance floor and attend review events together. One day at the Queen's estate, the stubborn Queen found herself unable to climb onto the tall white horse after she refused the servant to provide her with stirrups. At this time Alexander, without saying a word, picked up Queen Victoria and placed her on the horse. Alexander's behavior made the British officials present eager to drive this guy out of the UK immediately. However, the Queen issued an invitation to Alexander, inviting him to stay in the Queen's castle. Alexander even publicly announced that he would give up his status as the Russian crown prince, which made British officials feel threatened. Servants and maids in Windsor Castle were told to report the movements of Alexander and Queen Victoria at all times and to block all secret passages in the castle to prevent them from doing anything. Finally, the Russian envoys entered Windsor Castle with the Queen's consent. They tied Alexander, who was still sleeping, into a rice dumpling and prepared to take him back to Russia. The Queen looked at the carriage slowly driving away from the window, a tear shed from the corner of her eye. Maybe she was thinking that it would be nice if she were not the Queen, and maybe she could be with the person she loves. However, the Queen of England has no right to choose. She must be a cold political animal. The contradiction between Britain and Russia competing for world hegemony cannot be reconciled, and there will inevitably be a war between the two countries. Even if Alexander gave up the Russian throne, as a member of the Romanov family, he wouldn't like a family enemy, right? Alexander finally returned to Russia. He hated the Russian court, but there was nothing he could do about it. It was his home. He hated the autocratic Tsar, but there was nothing he could do about it. That was his father. Fate seemed to want him to accept all this, but Alexander did not want to give in. This relationship with Queen Victoria was just a small episode in his life, and he soon fell in love with someone else. Zenla, Sun. In the battle at the beginning of 1837, 1,300 Chandler and puppet soldiers were captured. The able-bodied were left to do coolies, and the others were sent to mines. In fact, Kampong Som is adjacent to the Elephant Mountains and has a lot of mineral deposits, including copper, iron, manganese, zinc, lead, phosphoric acid, lime, and even red and sapphire mines. However, it only lacks coal, so we want to develop large-scale development here. Industry is almost impossible. However, small factories can still be established. The Austrians established a small arsenal, a smelter and a steel plant here, just to maintain the normal operation of Kampong Son, and reduce costs. At this time, the only goods that Zenla could provide to Austria were copper, rubies, sapphires, and high-quality wood. As for the rubber trees planted, it would take many years before the rubber could be tapped. Because of this, the Austrian Imperial government has little interest in this place, and only the church will spare no effort to develop this place. Even for the church, Franz would draw pie for them every day, saying that this place is bordered by Siam to the west and Vietnam to the east. It has a bright future, and they are filling the gap of Catholicism in Southeast Asia. Chapter 131 Ending. Austrian Empire. Graz. The Oak Hotel was actually booked, which made many businessmen and nobles who were fleeing the flood very unhappy. However, when he saw the Rothschild family crest, he had to leave in anger. Solomon Rothschild was sitting alone by the stove. Days of heavy rain had caused the temperature to drop sharply. The alternation of hot and cold gave him a cold, and the doctor's bloodletting treatment made him feel cold all over. What was colder than Solomon's body was his heart. How he hoped that this flood could directly wash away all the scum in Vienna and drown them in the Danube forever. Solomon lost a lot of things in the past few years, including money, railroads, allies, organizations, the empire he built, and his self-confidence. This heavy rain will undoubtedly cause a reduction in grain production, and the price of grain will further rise. The grain he threw out before will definitely fetch double the price if sold now. Solomon wanted to endure it, but the more he thought about it, the more angry he became. The only way to break the situation now was to buy grain from the United States to suppress Austrian grain prices. As for Russia, he did not dare to go. Solomon had already purchased grain from the United States a month ago. At that time, the price of grain in the United States had doubled to twice the previous price, but it was still lower than the price of grain in Austria at this time. The grain was already on its way, but if he wanted to recoup his money, the price difference was not enough, so he thought of a good idea. A bolt of lightning pierced the night sky, and Solomon's face looked distorted and terrifying. In Hungary, the Drava River suddenly burst, causing a large area of farmland in southern Hungary that was not seriously affected to be washed away. People in Hungary feel that the flooding of the south is a reflection of fairness and justice in the world. Many nobles in the parliament were thinking about how much good land they could buy from the poor after the flood. HNIE looked worried. With the money in his hands, it would be a drop in the bucket to help those affected by this disaster. Hungary was extremely weak at this time. If an uprising broke out, it would definitely make the situation worse. If the Hungarian army could not suppress it, the Austrian army would intervene. He really didn't dare to think about what things would be like by then. Food prices in Austria have nearly doubled. This situation is simply the end of the country. On the streets of Vienna, the floods had just receded, and long queues formed in front of bakeries. The mixed bread, which usually no one bought, became a bestseller. The price of mixed bread is only 30% of that of ordinary bread. It is not clear whether it is mixed with wood chips, stones, or mouse hair. Dead fish on the streets were being fought over and taken home. Large groups of women and children in the suburbs were looking for ferns and other food to satisfy their hunger in the grass. This tragedy was repeated not only in Vienna, but also in major cities in Europe at this time. In this era, ordinary people had very little savings. Once there was a famine, they would have to beg everywhere. Fortunately, each country had its own measures. At the same time, there were plants and prey in the wilds of Europe that could satisfy hunger all year round, so the scale of the famine would not change. Very big. Food crises are usually accompanied by plague epidemics, a surge in theft cases and refugees. The Austrian government knows very well that Austrian businessmen now have grain in their hands, so they directly limit the price and do not allow the price of grain to exceed 1.7 times the original price. The royal family takes the lead in complying with the regulations, and the businessmen will make money anyway, so they will naturally not cause trouble. If you want to sell Austrian grain abroad, you must pay a tax that is twice the price of the goods themselves. As for those businessmen who want not to pay taxes, they will be stopped by the army at the national border. How much the army will take from them depends entirely on the mood of those soldiers. While Austria restricted grain exports, almost all states in the German Zollverein began to restrict grain exports. In comparison, food prices in Austria are the lowest in Germany. At the same time, the Austrian government has also introduced a lot of related relief policies. The most important of them is to provide relief for work. France is not prepared to let civilians suffer. There are many large-scale projects in Austria that need urgent repairs, such as railways and dredging of rivers. France is also planning to build a dam on the Danube River and raise the height of the river in Vienna. The height of the embankments was increased to prevent Vienna from being flooded again. These projects required a large number of cheap labor. Franz's proposals were sent to the Regency Council. Archduke Franz Karol and Archduke Louis signed without even looking at them. Count Karl Olaf and Prince Metternich on the side were a little embarrassed, but they also signed one after another. Own name. The original intentions of all Franz's actions were good, and they could indeed solve the problems currently faced by the Austrian Empire. However, there was one thing that made Metternich and Count Korolov very upset, and that was that the Austrian imperial government had to purchase the royal family at market prices. The matter of food, refugees and poor people from all German states are pouring into Austria crazily, and this behavior is also encouraged by the governments of all states. After all, these victims are refugees when they stay in their own countries, and refugees are the source of evils, including plague, theft, and riots. All are closely related to the word refugee. Prussia, Berlin. William III took a swig of opium wine to calm down. Wielich, why can't grain prices in the Rhine region be suppressed? Why are the grains you purchased from Russia only 1/3 of the original plan? Because there is no food and no money. Wielich replied, I clearly allocated funds to you. Why do you still say you have no money? You must be lining your own pockets, you shameless bastard. William III's eyes were red, and he coughed repeatedly. His body was no longer what it used to be, and the raw just now was exhausted. All his strength. I arrived in Russia and paid the money, but I only got 1/3 of the food I originally planned. It was obvious that Russia had torn up its previous agreement with Prussia, and of course there was someone else who let Russia make the decision. Friedrich List arrived in Russia first and met with His Majesty the Tsar. Dear His Majesty the Tsar, it is my honor to work with you on behalf of the United States of America to reach an agreement on food prices that will benefit both of our countries. Mr. Lister, don't you know that King William III of your country is my father-in-law? Dear Your Majesty, but this time you are trading not only with Prussia, but also with France, Spain, Sardinia and the Low Countries. As long as Russia and the American Republic can jointly protect the bottom line of prices, profits of hundreds of millions of dollars will be at your fingertips. Franz, on the other hand, continued to purchase wasteland in Hungary with the money he earned from the imperial government. Of course, the imperial government did not actually suffer much loss, because except for Austria, the grain in surrounding countries quickly rose to 3 times the price at the beginning of the year. Even if it paid double the fine, it could still make money by selling it to the countries of the German customs union. Why? William III asked reluctantly. The Russians said they had to pay more. Wielich replied, treacherous Russian barbarian. I'm so blind. The angry William III grabbed the opium wine beside him and drank it hard. Suddenly he fell down stiffly. The imperial physician was helpless about William III's condition, so Friedrich List brought in a doctor who was said to have saved many lives by transfusing sheep's blood. In desperation, everyone agreed to transfuse sheep blood. William III died. Chapter 132 Destiny. When William IV came to the throne, the first thing he did was to catch Friedrich List, who proposed sheep blood transfusion. However, by this time Friedrich List had already arrived in the United States. United States, Washington. Mr. Great talent. I have to be Mr. As Martin Van Buren held Friedrich List's hands tightly. This time Americans were able to make so much money in this food crisis, which was inseparable from Friedrich List's advice. Friedrich List not only used this food crisis to pay off his debts, but also successfully became the United States Secretary of State. Mr. Lister, I sincerely hope that you can use your ingenuity to help the United States of America get out of this economic crisis. Martin Van Buren said sincerely, the United States is not an empire, it is a democratic country that can attract and organize the power of almost all mankind. The political system of the United States is the highest crystallization of human political wisdom. She does not believe in occupation or slavery, but she believes in equality and fairness, believe in science, believe in creation, and believe in development. It is a duty to make America great again. Friedrich List also held Martin Van Buren's hand tightly, and both sides saw sincerity in the other's eyes. This economic crisis successfully saved American agriculture and also gave the US government a lifeline. Because the economic crisis and the defeat of Texas had already discredited the US government. If Martin Van Buren didn't do something, I'm afraid he would about to be ousted. The United States has a vast land and a population of 17 million. As long as time passes, it will definitely be a force that cannot be ignored in the world. Point. If history proceeds normally, the United States will annex Texas, New Mexico, and California, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Point. However, at this time the United States had not yet fulfilled its manifest destiny, for which it had to defeat France and Mexico. Point. Although the United States has signed secret treaties with France and Mexico respectively, the United States hopes that France and Mexico will fight to the detriment of both sides. However, the United States encountered new problems. Canadian rebels attacked the British Army in Toronto. The American transport ship Caroline was hired to enter Canada to transport weapons to the rebels. The British Army in the Canadian colony sent a force into the port of Slots in the United States and destroyed the transport ship Caroline transporting weapons for the rebels. At the same time, 2 Americans were killed and many others were injured. Point. The local government in the United States claimed that the British violated the sovereignty of the United States, and the British commander insisted that this was self-defense. Point. Historically, Britain did not choose to entangle with the United States. However, the commander of the British Army in Toronto at this time pointed out that the Americans transported weapons to the rebels and also sent military personnel into the British colonies. The behavior of the Americans was a naked invasion. The US government we should apologize to the UK. Point. Of course, the reason why this alcoholic commander suddenly became enlightened and could refute the American fallacies with reasonable evidence is naturally attributed to our Archduke Franz. Originally, Viscount Melbourne was unwilling to have too much trouble with the United States due to the cotton and grain trade. Point. But a conspiracy theory suddenly emerged that the United States may be behind the Toronto Rebellion, and that the Americans were ready to overthrow British rule and fulfill their manifesto. There was an immediate quarrel within the British Parliament because the United States was a country founded on a British colony, and the United Kingdom had every reason to believe that the United States wanted to annex Canada. Point. John Adams, the second president of the United States, once said, "The United States is destined to expand throughout the western part of the northern hemisphere." Obviously, in the eyes of Americans, Canada should belong to the United States. Point. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, also said this: "Annex the Canadian region, including Quebec, and just move forward, attack Halifax, and finally drive the British power out of the American continent." Moreover, the United States has indeed attacked Canada, and it is entirely possible that it will do so again. After all, they once planned a rebellion against Mexico and Texas. If the United Kingdom does not take action, the Americans are very likely to replicate it in Canada. Point. The domestic Chartist movement made Britain eager to shift its conflicts externally. Point. As a result, a very harsh letter of credence was delivered to Martin Van Buren's desk. Point. The British government questioned why Americans participated in the rebellion in the British Canadian colony and provided weapons to the rebels. Is the United States prepared to ignore the sovereignty of the United Kingdom, or does the United States already regard Canada as American territory? Britain's credentials immediately caused an uproar in the US cabinet. Some people clamored to go to war with Britain and bring freedom and democracy to Britain. Others proposed to immediately make compensation to Britain because the United States could no longer afford it at this time. A big war, not to mention France and Mexico watching covetously. Point. President Martin Van Buren made a public speech insisting that the people on the Caroline were civilians, not military personnel. At the same time, he sent troops to strengthen border security and announced that the United States would not intervene in Canada's internal affairs. He also said that the people on the Caroline were civilians and not military personnel. The personnel were deceived by the rebels, and the US government was willing to compensate the British troops for the losses they suffered. Point. This can be regarded as barely saving the face of the United States, and it also occupies the moral high ground. Point. On the other hand, the British government itself has no interest in the Caroline incident. It is just an overreaction, because it is afraid that the United States may get involved in Canada. Since the United States has announced that it will not support the rebels and is willing to do anything to the British Army, they don't want to continue to struggle with this matter, even if they have to pay compensation. After all, Britain and the United States still need to continue doing business. Moreover, the United States was too big for Britain to conquer, so it was better to continue trading and make money. The United States later paid $3,000 in compensation to the British colonial forces in Canada, which was exactly 3 times the price of the weapons confiscated by the British on the Caroline Point port of Venice. It has been more than a month since the grain purchased by Solomon Rothschild from the United States arrived in Hong Kong. However, he is not happy at all. Because of Austria's price limit order, not only can't he make money on these grains, but he also has to pay shipping costs. Now you have to pay corresponding duties when shipping it back. Solomon's self-concealed method was as ridiculous as a clown in front of this price limit order. Of course, he later sold the grain, which indeed helped the Austrian government stabilize prices to a certain extent. Count Zichenai's worries proved to be unfounded. In order to relieve the victims, the Austrian government built water conservancy projects, dredged rivers, and built dams in Hungary. It did not deliberately intensify the conflicts among the victims and take the opportunity to suppress Hungary as he feared. The royal family later bought large tracts of wasteland from him, but this should be a good thing for Hungary. Although the royal territory does not provide tax revenue to Hungary, it can absorb disaster victims to a certain extent, which can at least alleviate Hungary's internal conflicts. However, Count Zichenai soon discovered that one ship after another sent a large number of German refugees to Hungary, where they were organized to reclaim wasteland and build houses at the same time. The stabilized refugees will spread what they saw and heard in Austria back home. Austria has jobs, food, and land and houses as a result. More poor Germans chose to make a living in Austria instead of the United States across the ocean. Historically, the German population suffered a serious loss during this period, and the vast majority of them went to the United States, which to a certain extent also promoted the development of the United States. Chapter 133, Setting the Mountain on Fire. The book continues from the previous article. After witnessing the powerful combat power of the Sciterii, Guan Jinping and others decided to join the church. As the battle ended, many family members of the rebels found Kampong Som, and the total number of Chenla rebels reached nearly 8,000. Food for these 8,000 people is a problem, plus the shelter they need. There was a heated discussion in Kampong Som. Although the various factions disagreed on how to deal with Chenla's rebels, some people think that the Chenla rebel army should be placed in the Xiangshan mountains and let them consume the strength of the Vietnamese. Others think that they are embarrassing and useless. It is better to set aside a special area for them to contribute to the construction of the territory. But one thing can be agreed upon, that is, Guan Jinping's team cannot be allowed to enter the city. There is a saying that has been believed in Southeast Asia since ancient times: princes, generals and prime ministers would rather have their own kind, now that the Chenla royal family is in decline and the country is fragmented. I'm afraid that there are many people who have other ideas. This kind of good use will be of great benefit to the construction of Kampong Som, but if not used well, it may suffer greatly. The main problem now is that the original Zenla army had 8,000 people, and almost everyone had a gun, and most of them were strong laborers in addition to the 800 Sciterii. Kampong Som's combat strength was the church's fighting brothers, but the two together only amounted to more than 1,000 people. It would be okay if it was a frontal battle or a defensive battle, but it would be very troublesome if the other party launched a sneak attack. Once these people were allowed into the city, the situation would be completely out of control. The only way the Austrians in Chenla could think of was to write letters to their country asking for help, and at the same time recruit parishioners for simple training. Once an emergency occurred, they would be given weapons to help defend the city and fight. However, this can only ensure the safety of Kampong Som city, but cannot guarantee the safety of the entire area. At the same time, it also limits one's own activities. In fact, Franz had already thought of this possibility, and the solution he proposed was to divide and disintegrate. First of all, Chenla officials who had long-term trade relations with Austria could become religious and enter the city. Secondly, if you can provide treasures, information, or special personnel who can speak German, you can also join the church and enter the city. Thirdly, those who want to join the religion in the city can be trained first and then selected. The outstanding and pious ones will be retained to participate in actual combat. Those who have outstanding performance in 3 consecutive battles can join the religion and the city point at the same time. One thing must be implemented well: the 2 basic points of the church and the German language. The new parishioners must be able to speak German, and the class must be downplayed in the city, especially among the Chenla people, while the class must be strengthened outside the city, so as to facilitate the rule point. News of the defeat of Renau and Luojian quickly spread to the rear, and the Vietnamese generals who led the troops were in disbelief. Fan Zhu and Zhang Mingjio were both second-rank generals, but they were always bullied by Zhang Mingjio. If the news of this defeat was used by Zhang Mingjio, he might not be able to keep his position as general. As for the words of the Zenla puppet army in front of him, Fan Zhu didn't believe it at all. He didn't believe that any army in the world could hurt people with black smoke. On the contrary, he felt that these mere spies might be pretending to defect to David, and at this moment they were using nothing more than a bitter trick. Their purpose is just to delay him. At the same time, Fan Zhu also understands that failure is not allowed in the David army. The loser will only die. So what Fan Zhu has to do now is to kill all these mere people, and then personally captured Kengzun and gave an explanation to the leader of the Yu Kingdom. Guan Jinping and others were surprised by the changes in Kampong Som. They did not expect that the former fishing village had turned into a city. The city walls of Gundam are as grand as any other big city in Chenla, and coupled with the large western style buildings, it gives people an unreal feeling. Guan Jinping also noticed a feature: the parishioners here actually wore foreign cloth. Compared with homespun cloth, foreign cloth was beautiful and strong, and only few people in Zenla could afford it. At this time, there was less trade between Chenla, Vietnam, and the West, so this situation occurred. The previous officials Jinping and Perisu forged the edict of the former King Anzan, and assigned Kampong Som and its surrounding counties to Austria. Now Guan Jinping was holding a document of revolt and a document granting the 2 provinces of Kampot and Kokang near Kampong Som to the Austrian Empire. Guan Jinping had seen how powerful Kungzun was at this time in the previous battle. Now he just wanted to find a good supporter for his tribe and exchange the 2 documents in his hand for one to spend the rest of his life in peace. Franz is very satisfied with the fact that Guan Jinping forged the Edict of Emperor Zenla. After all, it is best to die without proof, which can save Franz a lot of trouble. Of course, Franz also knew very well that Jinpan, the edict official, could forge one copy and many copies. So Franz did not want the edict, but the tool for forging the edict, which was Anzan's jade seal. For this reason Franz was willing to give Guan Jinping a position as assistant to the bishop. Although the assistant bishop is a priest, at this time Kampong Sun is equivalent to the second in command, because this place is temporarily controlled by the church. Ambrosius also returned to Kampong Sun. He successfully found the ship anchored on the shore, but the people on it were not French people, but spies from the church, who had penetrated into Vietnam. Kampong Sun is still nominally the Grand Duke's territory of Ambrosius, and he is also the supreme commander here, so Kampong Sun is very happy that he can come back. But before they had time to celebrate, a sentinel sent back news that more than 20,000 people from the Pham Chu department of the Vietnamese army were trying to cross the Xiangshan mountains. Franz had already taught Archbishop Rosha a lesson, and the way to deal with this situation was fire attack. These things were written in the holy book that Rosha sent to the priests of Kampong. As a talented commander, Ambrosius also understood that setting fire to the mountain was the best choice at this time. The purpose is not to burn all the opponents to death on the mountain, but to slow down the enemy's progress and disrupt the opponent's deployment. As for whether it is possible to set fire in the tropical rainforest climate, please refer to the Amazon forest fire and Zhu Jiang's burning of the Vietnam soldiers. The reason why the Austrian army used fire to attack was also because the Vietnamese did not follow the usual path and had to imitate Hannibal and cross the Xiangshan mountains. If they could make a circle and attack from the main road, it would take them at least an extra month. At the same time, the so-called big roads in Vietnam in this era were not wide, and as long as a few bridges were blown up, they would have to wade across the river. As we all know, landing on the beach is never an easy task, plus the Vietnamese army the main weapon is a matchlock gun, which cannot be used once it is soaked in water. Austria's main weapon in Kampong Sound is a needle gun that is not afraid of water. This is also the source of Franz's confidence that a few hundred people can defend Kampong Sound. This is also the reason why there are thousands of guns in Kampong Sound's warehouse, but there are only 800 people in the Skaterii point, because in the warehouse in Kampong Som, most of the firearms are flintlock guns prepared to be sold to the Zenla people, and only those used by the Skaterii and the Austrian army are needle guns. Franz Zhu's team was very large and easily identifiable in the mountains. Kampong Som scouts set fire to the mountains, and the mountain fires soon turned into raging flames. Faced with the raging mountain fire, Franz Zhu could only choose to retreat. Chapter 134 scored twice. Franz Zhu chose to retreat in the face of the mountain fire, which was understandable. However, the retreat quickly turned into a rout point. After all, there were no walkie-talkies, telephones or other tools in that era that could effectively command the army. A team of 20,000 people faced the fierce fire point from the moment the retreat order was given. This team was no longer an army, they were a group of beasts eager to escape point. Crowds of people were jostling on the mountain paths, and the mountain fire behind them was getting stronger and stronger. No one wanted to be swallowed up by the mountain fire point, so some people chose to go directly into the woods and escape from a place with few people. Once one person does it, others follow suit. Soon these Vietnamese soldiers disappeared without a trace in the woods like dragons returning to the sea and monkeys returning to the mountains. The wildfire did not last long, and a heavy downpour fell only 2 hours later. Franz Zhu looked at the gradually extinguishing fire and asked his men to reorganize their troops. However, there were corpses everywhere in the mountains and forests. Some of them died in traps by mistake, some were killed by poisonous insects and beasts, some were beaten to death by their own people, and some were trampled. The only ones who died were those who were not burned to death. The generals of the Vietnamese army tried to gather the troops, but only 6,000 people were gathered in one afternoon, which was less than 1/3 of the number. When they set off, Franz Zhu picked up a stone and threw it at the deputy general next to him, but when he heard a bang, the deputy general's head exploded. This is of course not Fanchu's natural supernatural power, but the sentry of the Skaterii trying to gather the generals of the Vietnamese army. How could the Skaterii sentry miss this opportunity? As soon as the fire was extinguished, Skaterii scouts came out looking for valuable targets. They used rifle guns to shoot at a distance of 300 paces. Anyway, matchlock guns at this distance could not hit the opponent at all. Besides, it had just rained heavily, so whether those matchlock guns could be used was still a question. As long as you fire one shot and run away, it's impossible for the opponent to catch up. The sentries of the Skaterii had this mentality in mind and decided to try their luck. Franz Zhu, who was wearing a second-grade crimson general's robe, naturally became the main target of the sentinels. Among these sentinels, in addition to the Zenla people selected from the Skaterii, there were also many Austrian chasseurs. It is instinct for hunters to hunt high-value targets. In addition, because the church has learned about Vietnam's military system and officer ranks all day long, Franz Zhu, a second-rank general, has become the hunting target of many sentries. The first reaction of the Vietnamese officer who was attacked was not to command a counterattack, but to pull someone with a lower official rank than himself to stand in front of him. Ordinary soldiers try to find a valid reason to flee the battlefield. For example, there's a monster, the mountain god is angry, Buddha appears, the general has been punished by God, go home and collect clothes this afternoon. The remnant soldiers that Franz Zhu finally gathered dispersed in a hurry, while the surrounding generals each held a soldier or a low-level officer in their hands and were slowly evacuating. Soon gunshots were heard again from the burned forest land, and blood spurted out from the bodies of several Vietnamese soldiers. After all, Franz Zhu was a second-grade Vietnamese general, and he immediately stopped the soldiers by drinking. Come back, it's not a monster, it's those Zenla people who are beating us with guns. Hurry, raise your guns and fight back. At this time, Fan ZHU's soldiers drove back those soldiers who had not had time to escape with knives, gave them matchlocks, and asked them to shoot at Kampong Som sentry point. Why didn't this group of Fan ZHU's soldiers use their matchlocks to shoot at the sentries of the Skaterii? The answer is that Vietnam's matchlock guns during this period were mainly purchased from the Qing dynasty. As you know, the military industry of the Qing dynasty was very rough in workmanship, unstable in performance, and would often misfire. Even the Qing dynasty deliberately tampered with the firearms sold to Vietnam in order to weaken Vietnam's strength. Therefore, Fan ZHU's soldiers had to use knives to force the temporarily captured strongmen to use matchlock guns to shoot with the sentries of the Skaterii. Of course, the sentries quickly retreated back to reload and prepare for the next round of shooting, but 2/3 of the Vietnamese army's matchlock guns could not be fired. The distance is 300 steps, and even if it is launched, the hit rate can be imagined. After a round of shooting, not a single sentry was hit. The loading of the old matchlock gun was not only troublesome, but also slow. Before the Vietnamese gunners had finished loading, the second round of shots from the Skaterii sentries came over after 3 rounds of fighting. The gunners had already fallen a large area. One of the soldiers suggested that the sword player should charge once, but he couldn't find the general, no matter what. Seeing the big fish slipping away, and the increasing number of Vietnamese troops, the Skaterii scouts picked up their guns and retreated to the camp. Seeing that the guys in Western style military uniforms who fired cold shots had left, the Vietnamese officers and soldiers cheered as if they had won a great victory. At this time, General Fan ZHU, who had been missing before, suddenly appeared and began to slap each officer in the mouth one by one. A bunch of losers, even a few petty thieves, can't deal with them. When we get back to the country, I will kill all the 9 tribes of you. General, please calm down. Those demons are too cunning. They are also on this mountain, and are detrimental to our Vietnamese army. It is not a crime of war, said a deputy general, who suggested taking the Xiangshan road. I'll chop off his head. Fan ZHU roared. Someone whispered, it's Vice General Hu. Bring him here, right here. I'm going to chop his head off. The man pointed to a corpse on the ground. Vice General Hu is right there. His head has been smashed. Fan ZHU looked at Vice General Hu's body and spat. You're getting an advantage. Fan ZHU stood up and walked down the mountain, and then said to the deputy general next to him, pass my general's orders to set up camp at the foot of the mountain. Tomorrow we will gather our troops and prepare to attack the city. At this time, there were still 3,000 people around Fan ZHU, and the fleeing Vietnamese officers and soldiers were rushing back one after another when the fire was extinguished. After all, if the general died, their whole family would have to finish playing. At night, Vietnamese troops continued to find the camp with torches. Of course, no one would admit that they had escaped. They only said that they did not hear the gunshots from behind, so they seemed to only follow the general's orders, so they stayed away from the battlefield. In the middle of the night, most of the Vietnamese army had fallen asleep, and only a few sentries were breathing heavily against the big trees. Suddenly, a fire broke out in the woods again. Fires were everywhere in the dark night, and the Vietnamese soldiers were awakened from their sleep by their companions. Some of them didn't even bother to put on their clothes, so they followed the large troops and ran to places where there was no fire. Damn Austrians, they are so cunning. I swear I will destroy them. In the early morning, Fan ZHU roared angrily as he looked at the camp that had been reduced to ruins. After some counting, he found that the number of soldiers around him was not less, but increased to 5,000. However, compared with the 30,000 when he first set out for the expedition, it was nothing to mention. At this time, Fan ZHU had no way out. If he couldn't win and go back, what awaited him would be the confiscation of his family and the extermination of his clan. Fan ZHU now not only wants to win, but also wants to win big. As for the lost soldiers, as long as they defeated Kampong Som and brought back more strong men, he didn't care about such small things. However, 2 fires caused heavy losses in his baggage, leaving only 800 muskets. It would be difficult to attack Kampong Som with the 5,000 men at this time, but soldiers could be had as much as they wanted in Chinla. He decided to go to camp at first to replenish his troops. Chapter 135 The Siege of Whitehorse. Zillion is an ordinary Chinla farmer. Because his village is very remote, he has to go to a small town more than 10 miles away every month to buy necessary daily necessities. But when he returned with a full load, he was shocked by the sight before him. There was a miserable scene everywhere. There was no living person in the village, and the open space at the end of the village was covered with headless corpses. Zillion ran home anxiously, wanting to confirm the safety of his home. When he entered the door, he tripped and almost fell. From his clothes, he could tell that it was his father. It's just that the old man has been dead for a long time. He still holds a hatchet in his hand, but his head is missing. Point on the firewood pile outside the house. A young man had a big hole in his stomach. The woman inside the house was lying in a pool of blood with her hair disheveled. Who is it? Who is it? Come out. I'm going to kill you. Zillion held his wife's headless body, and his angry roar echoed in the empty mountain village, but no one would answer him. Zillion buried the bodies of his father, wife, and children, and took out his family's steel arrowheads and the long knife his father had used from under the floor. Afterwards, Zillion set fire to his home, and when he came to the cliff next to the village, he found that several villages in the mountain were burning with unusual black smoke. He swore secretly in his heart, whether they are humans or monsters, we must kill them all, because they often do this. The Vietnamese officers and soldiers are very experienced, and they do not stay in one village for too long. After eating and drinking, they would go to the next village, sometimes burning the village to the ground, and sometimes not even bothering to do the aftermath, leaving only a small team to harvest heads. Zenla, Mingsan County. After several days of killing, Fan Zhu found some sense. He was sitting in the lobby of the county government office, holding the concubine of the county magistrate in his arms, while the magistrates of Mingsan County were kneeling on the ground begging for mercy. Fan Zhu didn't pay attention to the Zenla officials kneeling on the ground, nor was he very interested in the Nephrite Wang Xiang in his arms. He was thinking that his military strength had expanded to 12,000 people, and his war exploits had also been accumulated. Level 20,000 now. Should we continue to attack Kampong Som, or should we win and return triumphant? Fan Zhu didn't know why, but he wasn't sure of victory in attacking Kampong Som. Maybe it was because the wildfire happened so strangely. He never thought that the wildfire was man-made, because the weather in Chenla was rainy and humid. If you wanted to set a fire, you had to prepare flammable materials in advance, but if it rained, all preparations would be in vain. Therefore, for thousands of years, only the Ming Dynasty people used fire attacks in the Zenla and Jiaoxi areas. Vietnam was called Jiaoxi in ancient times. The Ming Dynasty was the one who beat Vietnam the hardest in history, so the Ming Dynasty holds great importance in the hearts of Vietnamese people. It was not difficult for the Skitarii to ignite the tropical vegetation in the jungle, because they used kerosene. Fan Zhu was still worried about how to choose. The prayer beads bracelet on his hand suddenly broke off, and the beads fell to the ground. Fan Zhu looked at the rosary beads on the ground, and made up his mind to let his men kill the county magistrate, and stop after one more big blow. Kampong Som, St. Michael's Cathedral. The priests finally found out in the Holy Scriptures how to solve the problem of the large number of Zenla remnants coming to defect. That is to give Kampot to the remnants of Chenla to take charge. Kampot province is a good place, adjacent to Kampong Som, relatively rich, easy to defend, and difficult to attack. Guan Jinping and others had no reason to refuse. Kampot was blocked by mountains to the north and the sea to the south. The only way was to bypass the Xiangshan mountains and take Kampong Som. Theoretically, if they got this land, they could build a country in the country of China, live a life of peace of mind. Guan Jinping himself felt that happiness came too suddenly, and the leaders of Zenla's remnant army also thought this proposal was too good, so they happily went to Kampot to take over the territory with a large group of troops. The main reason why France gave up Kampot to these defeated soldiers was that it was almost impossible to use them to consume the strength of the Vietnamese, and it would even enhance the strength of the Vietnamese. It is better to simply throw these defeated soldiers to Kampot province to promote Austria. France believes that it is hard to change the nature of a country, and these officials will soon find their identities. When the time comes, someone will beg Austria to rule over them. As for the so-called easy to defend, but difficult to attack, it depends on who it is. For the Vietnamese, it may be, but for the Austrians, they can go through the main road of Kampong Som, or use the sea advantage to force a landing. In short, Kampot province for Austria, it is just a piece of fat meat that can be eaten at any time point. But what Franz didn't expect was that the Vietnamese generals would lead their troops into the ravines and then into Kampot Point. Nguyen Jin Pun and others thought that under the banner of the Zenla Heavenly Army, the officials and people of Kampot would surely welcome them with tears in their eyes. However, the reality is that several counties along the way did not open their doors to the Zenla Heavenly Army. Many of the officials even claimed that they only obeyed the orders of the Vietnamese emperor. On the contrary, the largest groups of bandits nearby sent greetings. Nguyen Jin Pun threw the invitation to the ground angrily. If he had known this, he might as well have stayed in Kampong Sun as an assistant to the bishop. Now he can only go to Bama City to try his luck. After all, he has a concubine who belongs to the prefect of Bama. Point the White Horse prefect was nostalgic for his old friendship, but he just asked Nguyen Jin Pun to enter White Horse City with his accompanying guards. Official Jin Pan took out the edict he had made, but Governor Bama advised him to surrender to Dao Kingdom as soon as possible, and not to make any more unnecessary sacrifices. The two sides did not agree with each other and soon started to quarrel. Don't forget, you are from Zenla. Nguyen Jin Pun roared. So, what? Our current king was chosen by Vietnam. What else can we do? In fact, the Chenla people were quite dissatisfied with Queen An Mui elected by the Vietnamese, believing that she was just a puppet of the Vietnamese and not qualified to inherit the throne of Chenla. I am the late king's edict. Before Nguyen Jin Pun finished speaking, he was interrupted by the other party. Do you think we have to listen to you because there is no proof? Don't be so self-righteous. Master Chalung's approach is right. We are not the opponent of the Vietnamese at all. In order to preserve our strength, it is necessary to make compromises with the Vietnamese now. When we have enough strength, we will rebel against him. Nguyen Jin Pun knew that he could not convince the other party, so he left Bama City. Just when he was thinking about how to settle the 8,000 people under his command, news came that the Vietnamese were coming. How many people are there? How did they know we were here? Nguyen Jin Pun asked eagerly. He had a bad feeling. Could it be that the Austrians wanted to get rid of him by the hands of the Vietnamese? That's why I gave myself a good place like Kampot, so that everything can be explained. In all conscience, Franz really didn't expect that these two extreme situations could happen at the same time. Franz Zhu on the other side was also murmuring in his heart. He felt that his troops were as fast as the wind and unpredictable. How did these Zenla people know that they were going to attack Bama City? Who leaked the news? Is this all destiny? Franz Zhu took off the newly repaired Buddhist beads bracelet and threw it on a stone, shouting loudly, "Young men, our numbers are twice as many as this. Even if Buddha comes today, he can't save them." The Vietnamese officers and soldiers shouted in unison, "If you stand in the way of a man, you will kill. If you stand in the way of a Buddha, you will kill a Buddha." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 136 God Soldiers Descend from the Sky. Zenla, Bama City. Condon, the governor of Bama, also heard about the atrocities committed by the Vietnamese army. Now the Vietnamese are actually rushing to Bama City, and just now he actually drove away his savior. Quick, go and bring back the Zenla Heavenly Army. Jin Pan, an official outside Bama City, was still thinking about how to escape, but after learning that the Bama prefect invited him to enter the city, he made up his mind. If the Vietnamese retreated in the face of difficulties, he would seize Bama City. If Bama City could not be defended, if you want to stay, then surrender the city. On the other hand, Kampong Som had received intelligence from the believers about a Vietnamese army rampaging in Kampot province. To be honest, the growth rate of the Vietnamese army is a bit scary. In a few days, the number of soldiers doubled. However, according to the interpretation of the Holy Scriptures, the Vietnamese army only supplemented some strong men and masters. These people will need to go through at least several battles to become combat effective. At present, only 2 places in Kampot province, Kima City and King County, are relatively prosperous. But as you can tell from the name, the latter is by no means an easy place to attack. According to the instructions of the Holy Scriptures, the priests required to launch an attack on the new Vietnamese army to eliminate the opponent's effective forces before they could form combat effectiveness. Ambrosius also supported this approach. After all, Kampong Som was short of manpower. Compared with passive defense, active defense was more important. It is easier to concentrate forces during an attack and take advantage of Austria's advanced weapons and tactics. But if Franz is here, he will definitely stop their crazy behavior. Kung Fu originally only had more than 1,000 troops, plus the temporarily trained 3,000 militiamen. The total number is only 4,000, and some people have to be left behind. I'm afraid not many people can be mobilized to defend the city. The intelligence shows that the Vietnamese army plundered at least 100,000 people. This is of course an exaggeration by the local believers, but even if it is folded in half, this number is quite scary. Coupled with the Zenla people who may rebel at any time, it is impossible to lands really didn't know how to win. The reality is that Europeans in this era have no idea what failure is. Ever since the Spanish defeated the 80,000 strong army of the Inca Empire with 169 people, countless legends and rumors have dominated the mainstream of public opinion. The church's brainwashing work has also been very successful. These temporary armies of parishioners don't even ask how many enemies there are. They just want to know where the enemies are. The church's mobilization capacity also far exceeded Franz's estimate. Of the more than 600 Europeans in Kampong, 590 were ready to participate in the battle. In addition to the 800 Skateria and 3,000 temporarily organized militia, another 5 were mobilized. Thousands of religious people came to deliver supplies, and this time Kung Fu was mobilized in full force. Outside Bama City, the dark Vietnamese army began to set up camp, cutting down trees to build ladders, and even pushed several cannons weighing 1,000 kilograms from nowhere. Despite the heavy weight of these artillery pieces, in fact the caliber is not large, it's just that the workmanship is lagging behind. These Vietnamese cannons are more of a deterrent, otherwise there would be no need to cut down trees and build ladders. The gates of Bama City were closed tightly, and an envoy was sent to Phan Chu's barracks with gold, silver and food, hoping to make the Vietnamese retreat. However, Phan Zhu directly chopped down the envoy of Bama City and asked his men to tell the Bama prefect that if the city gate was not opened, the entire Bama City would be massacred. When the Vietnamese heavenly troops broke through the city, the city of Bama was filled with an atmosphere of fear and oppression. In order to appease the emotions of the civilians in the city, Condon, the governor of Bama, told the people that 8,000 Chenla officers and soldiers had entered the city and there was no need to fear the Vietnamese outside the city. However, this was exploited by the Vietnamese spies who had infiltrated into Bama City. They claimed that the Vietnamese were only here to suppress the bandits and not to massacre the city. It was the collusion between the Bama governor and the rebels that offended the great Vietnamese nation. As long as the city gates were opened, the magnified when the Vietnamese army enters the city, the superior officers of the Greater Vietnam Kingdom will definitely let them go. As a result, there was chaos in Bama City, and the North City Gate was actually captured by civilians. Naturally, the Vietnamese would not miss this opportunity, so they stormed the North City Gate. After a day of fierce fighting, both sides suffered losses, but the morale in Bama City has reached its lowest point. At this time, Guan Jinping was regretting why he did not choose to stay in Kampong Som, but instead chose to come to Kampot to grab territory. Guan Jinping's troops suffered heavy losses. Everyone looked at the city wall with horrified eyes, as if monsters would rush in at any time outside the city. The defenders of Bama City didn't know why they had to suffer such a disaster. They were all downcast. At night, there are still occasional battles in the city, and the Vietnamese outside are not idle either. They occasionally fire a few shots with the old-fashioned artillery collected from everywhere, which can scare the city defenders into fear in the daytime battle. The Vietnamese army only lost some temporarily captured strongmen. They were not Vietnamese at all, but Chenla people. It can be said that these strong men really fought hard to survive. There were only more than 3,000 people, but they rushed into the Bama city with 10,000 defenders. Although more than 2,000 people were killed, the Zendler people who were hacked to death were not. I know how many times it is Franz Joseph treated these strong men who survived, and they would become the backbone of the Vietnamese army in the future. In today's attack, Franz Joseph just wanted to test the defensive strength of Bama city, but he obviously overestimated his opponent. If he attacked the North Gate with all his strength today, I'm afraid that the Vietnamese would have captured Bama city by now. But if today's commotion at the North City Gate was just a trap by the Chandler people, then he would have to pay a huge price for it. Franz Joseph planned to use the strong men for 3 days first. After all, most of the defenders in Bama city were just civilians and the so-called Zendler rebels. They could not adapt to the high-pressure environment of the battlefield. 3 days of continuous harassment would break their spirit, disperse, and then send the main Vietnamese force to wipe out all the rebels in the city. Obviously, Franz Joseph regarded the remnants of Zendler's army in Bama city in front of him as the team that destroyed Renai and Luo Jian. He thought that, as long as Bama city was conquered, Zendler's resistance forces could be completely wiped out. 3 days of fighting have exhausted the strength of the Zendler people in Bama city. Many of the officers and soldiers defending the city have become nervous due to poor sleep, coupled with the continuous fighting and non-stop riots. The main force of the Vietnamese army, which had rested for 3 days, was waiting for the cannon fodder at the North City Gate to launch the 4th attack point. While the cannon fodder launches the 4th attack, the main force of the Vietnamese army will attack the South City Gate. News has been sent to the internal intelligence in the city. As soon as the main force of the Vietnamese army arrives, the South City Gate will be opened. At that time, the Vietnamese army will be able to march straight in and annihilate the Chandler army in the city in one fell swoop. The battle at the North City Gate was bloody and cruel. Driven by the supervisory team, the strong men roared and rushed towards the city. The officers in the city whipped the coolies hard and asked them to carry ammunition and stones to the top of the city. The old-fashioned artillery let out a dull roar and shattered a piece of the battlement. The rubble flew, and the defenders on the city let out a scream. Some cannonballs fell among the strong men below the city, creating an alley of flesh and blood. At the same time, the South Gate was quickly captured by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese soldiers who swarmed in killed everyone they saw and had no intention of fulfilling their promise. Everything was as Franz Joseph expected, but at the same time that the Vietnamese army invaded Kep City, an army from Kampong Som appeared behind them. There should be another chapter in the evening, which will end the plot of Zendler as soon as possible. Chapter 137, Breaking the City. Ambrosius was riding on a donkey holding a telescope, looking at the chaos inside and outside Whitehorse City, looking a little funny. Ambrosius wanted to find a horse, but due to the mountainous terrain and climate problems in this area, the locals preferred donkeys to horses. Donkeys have better endurance and are easier to feed, but they are less interesting as mounts. The battle situation in front of him was very chaotic. After all, Ambrosius graduated from a military academy, and he hoped to fight a more regular war. However, the current situation can no longer be controlled by him. Artillery, ready, cried Ambrosius. The 10 cannons of the Skiteria at this time were all moved from armed merchant ships, and even the gun mounts were temporarily built. Although it is a bit crude, it is still many times more advanced than the Vietnamese artillery. Franz Joseph also discovered this strange army outside the city, but when he saw the leader of the other party sitting on a donkey, he couldn't help laughing contemptuously. Knife. Players are ready to give them a blow. At this time, nearly 10,000 Vietnamese troops gathered at the South Gate. In Franz Joseph's heart, these 10,000 people were fighting soldiers who had seen blood, and they were definitely not comparable to the cannon fodder at the North Gate. 2,000 elites entering the city can completely capture the entire Bama city. The new enemy troops that appear are about 2,000 to 3,000. It should be more than enough to keep 8,000 troops here in order to prevent these temporary combat forces from suddenly collapsing. Ambrosius made them march in dense formations and columns as much as possible. In fact, the mainstream of this period was skirmish line plus Q. However, Ambrosius only asked the Austrian soldiers in his hands to form a shallow skirmish line and the rest were several large infantry phalanxes. Ambrosius did not have many professional artillery, and he used long-barreled heavy artillery removed from armed merchant ships, so the deployment was very slow. The speed and decisiveness of the opponent's reaction also surprised Ambrosius. If the opponent had a cavalry team, he would probably suffer heavy losses now. Because Ambrosius had been in constant contact with Chandler generals all year round, he found that they knew little about the role of artillery and were slow to start a war. After an order was issued, it might take several days for the army to execute it. So Ambrosius, how dare you prepare artillery in front of the enemy's formation with such arrogance? It's just that the Vietnamese seemed to send out shirtless knife players holding iron knives and wooden cards. They're here to die. It seems that there are only 2,000 people at most, but we have 4,500 people. Ambrosius couldn't help but sigh. Maybe they are here to die. Captain Bellefontaine pointed at the Vietnamese army at the city gate. They seemed to be cleaning something and trying to close the city gate. Only if their city can withstand artillery fire, what's the point of shutting it down or not? The power of artillery during this period had long exceeded the capabilities of traditional city walls, which is why bastions were the mainstream of European fortresses. Even the walls of Constantinople could not stop the fire of modern artillery, let alone the simple walls of White Horse City, which were made of soil, trees, and stones. Franz Joseph really wanted to let these cannon fodder die. He wanted to see the opponent's firepower and buy time to close the city gate. After all, siege warfare has been more beneficial to the defending side since ancient times, and this White Horse City is the representative of a high city and a deep pool. If it weren't for the fact that the Zenla people guarding the city couldn't be pulled away, and I came up with clever tricks, I really don't know how long the fight would have lasted. However, while Franz Joseph was still lamenting that his weapons were unpredictable, the Scuteri opened fire. The shells were not directed at the sword players rushing in front, but at the wall of White Horse City. The solid shell fired by the 16-pounder gun hit the city wall directly, and the huge impact directly opened a large hole in the 3-meter high and 1-meter thick city wall. This is not because the Austrians have advanced artillery, but more because the construction structure of the city wall of White Horse City itself is unreasonable. In addition, it has become a high-risk building due to hundreds of years of wind and sun. At this time, the city wall of Bama City was bombarded by heavy artillery, and it was like a candle in the wind in just one round. How is it possible? Franz Joseph murmured. His subordinates also found it very unbelievable, but instinctively wanted to persuade Franz Joseph to escape. At the same time, the sword players on the front line also joined the battle. To be honest, skirmishers are obviously not as useful as line infantry for this intensive charge of cold weapon troops. After 2 rounds of shooting, the Austrian skirmishers simply joined the queue directly. At first, the swordsmen could tolerate the sporadic shooting from the skirmishers, but their morale was shattered in the first round of battle with the line infantry. Due to the quality of the soldiers, even the pediatric tactic of 3-stage attack can only be accomplished by the main force of the Scuteri. As for the temporary recruits, Ambrosius's requirement is that only the first column is responsible for shooting, and the following ones are responsible for shooting. The remaining columns are responsible for loading and delivering guns. Even so, after a round of shooting, the Vietnamese army's sword players collapsed and fled around wildly. Some people ran towards Bama City, while others fled towards the mountains and forests. If Ambrosius had a cavalry, he would definitely give the order to pursue, but he did not. With the impact of the donkey, he could only make the opponent laugh to death. The remnant soldiers who fled into Bama City were not scary. What was scary were those who fled into the mountains and forests. They would become unstable factors in this land in the future. Franz Joseph ordered the army to guard the south gate, while he led a large force to attack the north gate. Although the city wall has collapsed in many places, those tall buildings still gave the Vietnamese army some psychological comfort. However, the Austrian artillery soon began to fire again. Although Ambrosius had seen that the opponent's army was overwhelmed, he did not want to sacrifice any of his soldiers and decided to continue the bombardment, forcing the opponent to fight. Go out of the city to fight on your own. Another point is that the Sciterii have a range advantage at this time, but once they enter the city for street fighting, the Sciterei's advantage will be greatly weakened, and they may even become passively beaten in street fighting due to problems with the firearms themselves. Heavy artillery bombarded round after round, and the ranks of the Sciterii were constantly approaching the city wall. However, the Vietnamese did not dare to fight back. First of all, they had no artillery. Secondly, neither bows, arrows, nor matchlocks were able to match the power and accuracy of the guards. Compared with the rifles in the hands of the teaching army. What's more, there are more than 100 skirmishers on the Sciterii side, and the rifled guns in their hands are not ordinary. The battle line at the south city gate was still advancing in an orderly manner, while the north city gate had turned into a mess. At first, the Vietnamese who suddenly came from behind Nguyen Dinh Pinh and others made them fall into despair. However, what happened next made Nguyen Dinh Pinh and the soldiers defending the city very puzzled. After the large group of Vietnamese troops coming from the south opened the city gate, they did not join forces with the Vietnamese troops at the door to clear out the people in the city. Instead, the defenders fought with the Vietnamese troops outside the city, and the scene was very tragic. In the end, the Vietnamese troops in the city broke through the defense of the Vietnamese troops outside the city and ran towards the mountains and forests. Just as Nguyen Dinh Pinh and others reorganized their defense, another Vietnamese army rushed towards the north gate. They seemed to be avoiding some terrible beast. In this way, Bama City was killed by the Vietnamese and passed through. However, the Vietnamese soldiers seemed to have no intention of capturing the city, and they all fled towards the mountains and forests in the north. This made the Chenla defenders who were kneeling on the ground ready to surrender feel very embarrassed. I will consider writing back to Europe tomorrow, but there are still some things to write about in Africa, such as the Battle of Blood River, Garibaldi in South America. Leave a message if you want to see it, and if you don't want to see it, leave a message. I'll see which side has more. Decide again. This is an extra update, counting votes and so on. Chapter 138, Night Talk in Heaven. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz successfully obtained 10.98 million florins from the Austrian Imperial government. Of course, it was the old rule, and it was still expected money. Jenny couldn't believe her eyes. The young man in front of her had been spending money, but the money in his hands was getting more and more. The purpose of this money is to allow more people to live a better life. Even the Austrian Imperial government that was cheated did not suffer any actual losses. It only paid for the expected banknotes that could not be exchanged. Solomon Rothschild's counterattack was actually defused so lightly, and his plan was completely disintegrated before it even took shape, so that most people had no way of knowing that it had ever happened. You must know that the Rothschild family at this time can be called the sixth great power in the world, and Solomon is the head of the Rothschild family in Austria. He is such a big shot. In front of Franz, he seems to have just met being played with like a walking baby. A price limit order not only shattered Solomon's dream of counterattack, but also completely collapsed the Vienna business alliance with a history of decades. Every time a price limit order appeared in history, it would be accompanied by an uproar. Merchants would try their best to ship the price limited goods abroad in order to obtain high profits. However, this price limit order has increased the price limit to 170% of the original price, leaving a huge profit margin for merchants without starving ordinary people. However, for those merchants who want to hoard, it's the end of the world, because the price limit means that all their previous efforts have been in vain. A large number of government projects have provided new sources of income for farmers who have nothing to do, which can just fill the vacancy caused by the food crisis. In this way, it not only solved the social problems that may be caused by too many refugees, but also solved the government projects that had been unable to be completed for many years for the Austrian Empire. The dredged rivers, repaved roads, newly dug water conservancy and irrigation systems and other infrastructure improvements were all improved. It will ultimately better promote the economic development of the Austrian Empire. There was just one thing that a Jenny couldn't understand, and that was why Franz had to let German immigrants reclaim the wasteland of Hungary. Doesn't he know that this will cause dissatisfaction in Hungary? Moreover, conflicts were prone to break out between German immigrants and local Hungarians, and it was difficult for the Austrian army to provide timely protection to those royal estates on Hungarian soil points due to strong opposition from Hungary. Only the Austrian section of the Danube Dam was built. The right to build the Hungarian section of the dam was in Hungary's hands, and of course the Hungarians had to pay for it themselves. These clamoring Hungarians doing things themselves, disappeared without a trace in an instant point, and someone like HNIE who sincerely wants good things for Hungary does not have enough strength and funds, so he is destined to build only shoddy projects. The solution HNIE could think of was to let the Hungarian nobles sell the unoccupied land to the Austrian royal family and use the unclaimed land in exchange for construction funds, and this is what Franz hopes to see, because according to Franz's estimation, there will be more and more immigrants in Germany. Because with the development of the German customs union, the contacts between German states and the Austrian Empire were also increasing, which made the Germans realize the power of the Austrian Empire. The country they used to live in was just a city or a province in the Austrian Empire. The fertile land in Hungary is not comparable to the barren soil in Germany. They had only heard of this kind of fertile land in legends on the other side of the ocean. Going to the United States would cost the whole family's savings, and they were more likely to encounter storms and pirates and die at sea. Of course, they might also be deceived and become indentured slaves every day, working in the cotton fields. But the Austrian Empire is right in front of you. German immigrants can easily reach it by boat or train. Even if they want to regret it, they can only spend an extra train or boat ticket point. Rather than abandoning everything, risking your life, and going to the New World to gamble on an invisible future, it is better to stay in Europe and try your luck in the Austrian Empire. After all, there is nothing to lose. Some of the Germans who came to the Austrian Empire to work hard returned to their home country after making money, perhaps to show off or to build their motherland. After some people made money, they settled in the Austrian Empire and tried hard to bring their families to Austria. Of course, more people are unable to integrate into Austrian society after making money. After spending all their money, they choose to go to Hungary to open up wasteland and farm. During the same period, if the Germans who chose to immigrate to the United States were unable to integrate into local life, they would have no choice but to die. It is not only the poor who like to work in the Austrian Empire, but also those scholars and artists who feel that their talents are underappreciated or no one cares about them. They also choose the Austrian Empire. After all, speaking German was a big advantage in the Austrian Empire, but it was nothing at all in their own country. At this time, the Austrian Empire, the Vienna-Prague-Dresden Railway, the Vienna-Linz-Salzburg-Munich Railway, the Vienna-Graz-Udine-Venice Railway, and the Vienna-Brno Railway had been completed. Those under construction include Graz-Ljubljana-Trieste, Venice-Lombardy, Venice-Parma, Brno-Krakow, and Brno-Lviv. The total length of the Austrian Empire's railways has exceeded 1,400 kilometers, which is more than twice that of France, 6 times that of Prussia, and nearly half of the British railways. At this time, Britain has the most railways in the world at 3,100 kilometers. However, the railway mileage owned by Britain will soon soar to 12,000 kilometers in 1850. Instead of adding another zero, British railways will enter an explosive period in the future. The railway construction in the United States is even more exaggerated. They will surpass the United Kingdom in 1850 and become the country with the longest railway mileage in the world, with a total length of 14,000 kilometers. All these laid the social foundation for the future economic development of Britain and the United States. Franz does not have such ambitious goals for the time being. He just wants to complete the railway network in the Lusitania region before the arrival of 1848. The total length is about 5,000 kilometers. However, due to the numerous mountains and rivers, the amount of work is larger than it seems. Much bigger. Franz sketched on the map for a while, then finally stopped and stared at Jenny thoughtfully. This made Jenny feel anxious for no reason. She always felt that the child in front of her seemed to have the ability to see through everything. Franz wished he had this ability so that he would have a lot of entertainment when he had nothing to do, but it was a pity that he didn't have it. Franz suddenly spoke. Miss Ajani, Namibia, Zulu, Congo, Ethiopia. You choose one. Ajani is a little confused. These are all African countries. What are Archduke Franz's plans? Could it be that he plans to colonize Africa, but the Austrian Imperial Navy may not be able to support his ambitions? Neither the Regency Council nor the military will support such a proposal. Archduke Franz, I don't know what to choose, but I want to remind you that with the current strength of the Austrian Empire, it may be difficult to support such ambitions. Maybe Namibia can, but what's the point of that rotten land abandoned by Britain and France? What's the value? Okay, next question. If Egypt and the Ottoman Empire fought, who do you think would win? Chapter 139, Night Talk in Heaven. Ottoman, Istanbul. The Grand Zeraculio Palace, on the top floor of a minaret, overlooks the Sea of Marmara and the Bosporus. The Ottoman Grand Vizier, Fairkak, was kneeling on the ground, waiting with Sultan Mehmed II for their guests. They are a notorious traitorous combination in history. Algeria was occupied by France, Tunisia became independent, Greece became independent, Serbia became a state within a state, Egypt Muhammad Ali became independent and captured Syria, Wallachia, and Moldavia became a Russian protectorate. The disastrous defeat in the 8th Russo-Turkish War, the disastrous defeat in the 1st Turkish-Egyptian War, the disastrous defeat in the naval battle of Navarino, the disastrous defeat in the Greek War of Independence, and the overwhelming unequal treaties firmly nailed them to the pillar of shame in history. There is a secret clause in the Winkarai-Scalisi Treaty that stipulates that once Russia requests it, Turkey will block the Dardanelles Strait and not allow any other country's warships to pass through. This makes the Ottoman Empire become Russia's site. They signed numerous agreements with European countries, and Europeans could enjoy a variety of privileges in the Ottoman Empire. However, these two men were actually the pioneers of the reforms of the Ottoman Empire. Even the Kemal reforms of later generations also drew on the reforms of Mehmed I. As soon as Mehmed II came to the throne, he took action to kill the guards, one of the main culprits in the chaos of the Ottoman Empire at this time. The Ottoman guards used to be the backbone of the entire empire, but now they are the most terrifying enemies within the empire. They oppose all reforms, and are powerful enough to prevent reforms. Without their elimination, reforms cannot be carried out. The Ottoman guards also killed the former Sultan, Mehmed II's father. He learned from his father's lessons, and made adequate preparations to completely eliminate the guards. When the Ottoman guards turned the camp pot upside down again, they also sentenced themselves to death. The camp pot is turned upside down, which means rebellion. The Ottoman guards planned to be like the mutiny in 1807. They once again swarmed into the Colosseum, and then marched murderously to the Sultan's palace, demanding the heads of the Sultan's reformist ministers, repeating the old mutiny process. Drama. It's just that Mahmud was not his father. At this time, the walls of the Grand Zeraculio Palace were filled with new artillery and soldiers with live ammunition. In just half an hour, this army that had made Europe and the world tremble for 5 centuries came to an end. What followed was a drama that continued to unfold in the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. Massacre. Mehmed II completely wiped out the remnants of the guards and the ulema system that had been colluding with the guards. For hundreds of years Mehmed II, who had eliminated the guards, was very high-spirited and immediately began to reform the army. Mehmed II did not choose an instructor from Britain or France, but instead chose Helmut Karl Bernhard von Moltke, a young lieutenant in the Prussian army, as an advisor to the Ottoman army. This young lieutenant became the old Moltke, who later became famous in Europe. Later, the Ottoman Empire also exchanged military cadets and officers with Prussia for exchange and study. From then on, the Ottoman Empire's army embarked on the road of Prussianization. Mehmed II abolished the backward timur system and tax farming system, which greatly strengthened the centralization of power and Ottoman fiscal revenue. At the same time, Mehmed II also promulgated a new code of law, abandoning religious authority and encouraging the development of industry and commerce. Beginning in 1824. The Ottoman Empire began to implement compulsory education, restored many closed universities, and at the same time, sent foreign students to Britain, France, Prussia and other countries to learn advanced culture and technology. Austria had a feud with Russia and the Ottomans, so it did not directly send students abroad. In addition, he also founded 2 military schools, one modeled on the Ottoman military academy founded by Napoleon, and the other was the Imperial Music Academy, which specialized in training drummers and musicians. Mehmed II even imitated Peter the Great, and objected to ministers growing beards, and gave heavy rewards to those who were willing to cut off their beards. He abandoned the traditional Ottoman robes, and wore Western-style military uniforms and breeches. He even changed the Ottoman habit of wearing turbans. The fez hat was specially invented. The fez, a cylindrical felt hat, usually has a string of tassels, and if a soldier or official has a crescent moon embroidered on it. After 1834, Mehmed II restored the ambassadorial system, and founded the first newspaper in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Monitor, after losing to Muhammad Ali in the First Turkish-Egyptian War. Mehmed II quickly rebuilt the Ottoman navy and even built the largest sailing battleship Mehmed in the world at that time. They also followed the example of the West in establishing arsenals, developing new guns and artillery, and encouraging the development of industry and commerce. However, as Mehmed II's reforms deepened, he encountered increasing resistance. Some religious groups encouraged local officials to launch uprisings, and even sent people to assassinate the Sultan and his important ministers at the same time. With the introduction of Western ideas and the increasing national crisis in the Ottoman Empire, the national consciousness of various ethnic groups in the country also began to awaken. The complexity of ethnic issues in the Ottoman Empire was not inferior to that of the Austrian Empire, especially with the support of internal and external troubles. Mehmed II's reforms were difficult to carry out. Several sects within the Xian Fang sect also openly opposed Mehmed II's reforms, because the reforms touched the interests of too many sects. Although the Ottoman Empire suffered repeated defeats in international wars, the civilians only felt that the Sultan was incompetent. The people still looked down upon Europeans, and some even paid high prices to buy white slaves to enhance the prestige of the Ottoman state. In the eyes of the Ottomans, Albanians equals people who sell stinky water, Dutch equals cheese sellers, French equals guys without faith, Austrians equals blasphemous pagans, Russians equals crazy pagans, British equals godless of fools, Italians equals descendants of slaves, Spaniards equals lazy pigs, Poles equals arrogant pagans. There is the Austrian Empire in the west and the crazy Russians in the north. These two countries have forced the Ottoman Empire to bleed on its frontiers for hundreds of years. The first thing every Tsar does when he takes office is to launch a Russo-Turkish war. The Austrian Empire has always regarded the Ottoman Empire as a serious concern. Although there has been no large-scale war between the two sides, small frictions have never been interrupted. The provinces close to the Austrian Empire are all areas with negative returns for the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France have been poaching the Ottomans. Greece and Algeria are their masterpieces, and now British Foreign Secretary Palmerston actually claims to protect the Egyptians in the Ottoman Empire and is preparing to establish a country for them. Palmerston's plan is this: people, everyone comes out, land, Ottoman comes out. Mehmed II really wanted to cut off this heretic's hands and feet immediately and throw him into the Red Sea to feed the fish. Within the Ottoman Empire, there was also Muhammad Ali, the black sheep. I a sinner? Mehmed II asked. No, you are the greatest sultan in the world, and I'm willing to follow you to the death. Fairchuk replied. No, I want you to live. I may not be able to witness the day when the Ottoman Empire rises again, but you must assist my descendants to continue my reforms, revitalize the glory of the Ottoman Empire, and one day kill all the infidels, and establish our world. Chapter 140. When the devil knocks on the door. Bang, bang, bang. There was a knock on the palace door, and the visitor strode into the palace of Mehmed II without waiting for the palace official to inform him. Seeing the arrival, Mehmed II and Grand Vizier Fairchuk both showed awkward smiles. The person who came was none other than the British ambassador Palmerston. However, this arrogant British man was the Ottoman Empire's biggest support at this time. The real sultan should not put his sword in its sheath, but should use it to punish the villains. Palmerston's words certainly meant something, which was to imply that Mehmed II should punish Egypt, use troops to take back the rights that should belong to him. Although Mehmed II had long hated Ali Pasha of Egypt, he was not yet ready to fight Egypt. At this time, the Ottoman army had 350,000 men, almost twice the size of the Egyptian army. The Ottoman Empire's navy also had an advantage over the Egyptian navy in terms of numbers. In terms of capital ships, The Ottomans had 3 first-class battleships, 6 second-class battleships, and 6 third-class battleships. Egypt has only 1 second-level battleship and 15 third-level battleships. However, Mahmud II was not sure of victory. He was more worried about the intervention of the French. At this time, France had been fighting fiercely with Egypt, especially the French helping the Egyptians train their troops, which made him resentful. Recently, the Englishman Palmerston has frequently hinted to Mahmud II that troops should be used against Egypt. Mahmud II is very curious about what the British want to do. He does not want to be used as a weapon without any explanation, and there is a group of crazy Russians behind him. Fear of the Russians was the biggest reason why Mahmud II did not dare to use troops against Egypt. Dear Mr. Palmerston, I don't understand what you mean. Mahmud II simply pretended to be stupid. Dear Sultan, you will soon understand, because the Egyptian Pasha Muhammad Ali has decided to refuse to pay tribute to you. This is a naked provocation, and I think you know what it means. This shameless thieves are trying to steal your kingdom. War. Palmerston's words shocked Mahmud II. He thought that Muhammad Ali would choose to hide his power and bide his time like him, instead of choosing an open break, because this would be bad for both the Ottomans and Egypt. Egypt. Manio Palace. Ali picked up his gold pipe studded with diamonds and took a long puff. The smoke he exhaled made the French envoy cough. I'm sorry, sir. I've choked you. What did Prime Minister Thiers say? Ali said with concern. It doesn't matter. Prime Minister Thiers said that France will always be Egypt's friend, and he is also willing to see you go further. The French envoy said. Ali was relieved. Everything was under his control. As long as he had the support of the French, he could defeat the British, because he had signed an agreement with the Russians. As long as the Russians could abide by the agreement, then the Ottoman Empire will eventually become history, and he, Ali, will become the only sultan in the world. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. After meeting Friedrich again, after being away for several months, Franz felt a little strange and asked, how come it's been a year, uncle, and you haven't grown any taller at all? Archduke Friedrich is less than 160 centimeters tall, while his eldest brother is 185 centimeters tall. There is a big difference between the two. You're not taller than me, Friedrich shouted angrily. I'm only 8 years old. Franz blinked. I've grown 8 centimeters this year. It's amazing how tall you are. I was taller than you before I was 8 years old. Be careful you become the same as me in the future. Apparently, the height issue was a taboo for Archduke Friedrich, so Franz comforted him. It is said that Napoleon was not very tall either. Don't compare me to the Corsicans, you bastard. The angry Archduke Friedrich wanted to pounce on Franz, but was restrained by Thalia and Ajani, and stood up. Thalia was 175 centimeters tall, and Ajani was 168 centimeters tall. Friedrich looked at his feet that were already off the ground, and his heart was filled with despair. Obviously, the height of the two women made Friedrich feel even more inferior. Just like that, Friedrich was carried back to his seat. Originally, Thalia was ready to comfort Friedrich, but Ajani winked at her and told her to leave quickly. Because Ajani could tell that Friedrich was very concerned about his height, and boys at this age were very impulsive. Moreover, as he is a royal prince, he may not take into account Thalia's identity as a woman. Uncle Friedrich, will growing bean sprouts in the water help the water quality? Franz decided to change the topic. After all, talking about other people's shortcomings is not a virtue. Forget it. You dare to say that it was all your bean sprouts that made the whole ship upset? Friedrich said angrily. Obviously he was deeply affected by it. Bean sprouts have some laxative effects, but as long as you don't eat them every day, you should be fine. Are the bean sprouts here in Europe some special variety? Uncle Friedrich, what do you usually eat on the ship? Bean sprouts. Didn't you say it can supplement vitamins and purify water? Why didn't I kill you? Franz thought to himself. Uncle Friedrich, you can eat something else instead of staring at those bean sprouts all day. Besides, haven't you successfully modified your steamship yet? If you have a steamship, you can use the steam engine to boil water for drinking. I encountered some problems. That is, most steam cargo ships are not suitable for transformation into battleships, so I decided to build my own. It is expected to be launched by the end of the year. Franz was about to speak when he was interrupted by Friedrich. I know what you want to say. You don't have to worry. The training of the Marine Corps has been basically completed. The performance of this unit will definitely surprise the world. The Austrian Empire Marine Corps will definitely become famous in one battle. Although, I don't want to pour cold water on Friedrich. The performance of the Austrian Empire cannot be too dazzling. Because the Austrian Empire at this time did not have enough strength in Central Europe, a place of 4 wars. Being too dazzling was a problem. Uncle Friedrich, this is not a battle that deserves to be famous. Don't worry, I understand what you mean. I also have plan B. I have found someone who can cooperate with us within the Egyptian army. Archduke Friedrich said. Who? Those Jews? Franz blurted out. This was a very bad habit, but he had heard something recently that made him unconsciously reveal his thoughts. Jews? No, 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 I don't want to deal with those people. Archduke Friedrich shook his head. That is the Karamanli family. They are willing to assist us and cooperate inside and outside, but cooperating with the Karamanli family may have a bad impact on the reputation of the empire and the family. The Karamanli family were the notorious Barbary pirates. Chapter 141 Transaction. Reputation? Why do you think so much? Besides, we don't need to admit that we have cooperated with the Karamanli family. They will take the initiative to admit that this is just revenge against Muhammad Ali. The Karamanli family once went to Egypt to request Muhammad Ali's help, but the family members sent there were detained first, and then their heads were chopped off and given to the Ottoman Sultan to ease the relationship between Egypt and the Ottomans later. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II took the opportunity to execute many members of the Karamanli family. Therefore, it seems logical that the Karamanli family would seek revenge on Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. However, this family's reputation is really bad, and their family's rise to power relies on countless conspiracies and assassinations. So, what's the price? Franz wanted to ask what they wanted. After all, at this point in time, the sudden appearance of allies was most likely to be bait. They demanded that Tripoli be separated from the Ottoman Empire, and were willing to submit themselves to the Austrian Empire, and pay an annual tribute of 50,000 florins. 50,000 florins? Franz looked down upon the money. For the huge Austrian Empire, 50,000 florins was really insignificant. For a country like Tripoli with only desert, 50,000 florins is already a lot. They also sent an envoy. Do you want to see them? Friedrich said. It seemed that the envoy of the Karamanli family was quite capable, otherwise Friedrich would not have brought him to see Franz. It's just that Franz suddenly had an idea whether the other party was a woman. That's why Friedrich was so enthusiastic about this kind of thing. However, it turned out that Franz was overthinking. The other party was a typical Arab. Although he was wearing a Western-style military uniform, he still couldn't hide the smell. In the Arab countries of this era, it would be strange if there was a female messenger. The other party was surprised when he saw Franz. Friedrich, the naval commander, was young enough, but Franz was just a child. He looked at the maids around him and showed a kind of expression, a look of disgust. Hello, distinguished Archduke Franz. I, Abbas Karamanli, the legal heir of Tripoli, extend my most sincere blessings to you. May you live a long life. Hello, Mr. Abbots. Why did you choose us as your allies? It was Archduke Friedrich who found me. He said there was a way to avenge me and bring my family back to Tripoli. You know, the shameless Mahmud II exiled my family in the name of protection. Alberts told his tragic story, but Franz had no interest in it. Now there was no need to worry that this Alberts would be a bait. Do you know where Muhammad Ali hid his real main fleet? I know that the craftsmen responsible for building battleships for the Egyptians are servants of our Karamanli family. I can take you to find those ships, but the dock has been protected by Allah's heavy troops. And if you want to scuttle those battleships, at least it requires hundreds of people, and even using explosives is not an easy task. What's more, once explosives are used, my people will not be able to come back. No matter how tight the defense is, there will be loopholes. As for how to deal with those warships, this is a problem for our Austrian Empire. As long as your people can provide intelligence and cooperate with us to disrupt the Egyptian deployment, your people do not need to participate in the battle. Albert thought Franz wanted him to launch a suicide attack, but Franz still couldn't completely trust the people in front of him. He was considering whether to contact the Jews. Maybe those Jewish businessmen were more reliable. Then, can you help us restore our country? I'm just a kid. Franz spread his hands. But if everything is true, I can assure you that Tripoli will be independent, and the Austrian Empire will conduct fair trade with you. As for whether it can take back Tripoli, it's up to you to control it. Unless, although Albert felt a little incredible, he subconsciously knelt down and tried to kiss the boy's shoes in front of him, but Franz quickly dodged it. The Karamanli family is willing to surrender to the Habsburg family forever. My family is very good at business. We can make a lot of money for the Habsburg family. I also have a daughter. She is very cute. Franz didn't want to pay attention to this guy, and the more he spoke, the more outrageous he became. Jenny saw Franz's impatience from the side and said, Archduke Franz, it's time for you to go to class. You shouldn't keep Mr. Doubler waiting. That's right. Franz looked like he suddenly realized it, and then said to Friedrich, this is the seawater distillation device designed by Mr. Doppler. It only needs to be connected to the steam engine of the warship itself. It doesn't matter. It will lose the power of the warship, which uses heat energy. Franz escaped with Thalia and Ajani, while Friedrich was very fascinated by the design in front of him. After all, the current distillation device of the Navy still had to be at the expense of steam kinetic energy. The design of the distillation device is not complicated, but it is very practical. It uses the heat emitted by the steam to heat it, turning seawater into water vapor, and then transporting the water vapor to the condenser, to become distilled water. Istanbul, Grand Sarajevo Palace. Mahmud II was still in disbelief at the facts before him. He did not believe that Muhammad Ali would do such a stupid thing. Because the tribute paid by Egypt to Osman at this time was just a symbolic act and could not cause much loss to Ali. Palmerston once said that the first generation of understanding kings was afraid that the world would be in chaos. There are only 3 people in the world who understand Europe. One is Prince Albert, who returned to the West, one is a German professor, who is crazy, and the other is me. But I forgot. The appearance of France and Egypt at this time was a complete accident. Palmerston was a true believer in the Russian threat theory, and practiced it throughout his life. Dear Sultan, you don't have to worry about the threat from Russia. Believe me, Britain will never sit back and watch the territory of the Ottoman Empire continue to be annexed by Russia. It was in Britain's interest to block Russia within the Black Sea and monopolize the Ottoman legacy in the Near East. Mahmud II knew that what Palmerston said was true, but he still did not want to send troops to Egypt because his army advisor Moltke told him that his new army was not up to the level of the Prussian army, and even the Austrian army, a ragtag army of people, is inferior. Palmerston saw Mahmud II's hesitation. But he had many options. For example, using the British's favorite trade method can not only maximize British interests without spending a single soldier, but also completely destroy the Egyptian economy. Dear Sultan, I have a way. You can sign a trade agreement with Britain and abolish all monopoly systems in the Ottoman Empire. Mahmud II hesitated. He didn't know what medicine was sold in Palmerston's gourd. Muhammad Ali has been able to wage war for so many years only because of the huge profits gained from his 3 monopoly sales of cigarettes, sugar, and cotton. Believe me, as long as there is no money, the Egyptians are like cats without teeth. Mahmud II thought it made sense, but he did not know that the agreement he signed would also ruin the possibility of the rise of the Ottomans. Please vote for support. Chapter 142. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz leaned back leisurely in his chair, and Thalia read Franz the newspaper. Ajani was reading the report. Franz arranged for her to be in charge of the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry, but the actual controller was Lucensina. Luxemzina will send a large amount of intelligence every week. most of which is useless garbage. Only a very small amount will have an impact on the current situation, and the burden of judging the value of this intelligence falls on Ajani alone. On the body point, she really wanted to throw all the information to Franz, but she knew very well that the consequences of doing so would be to be marginalized. Not only would her freedom be hopeless, but her life might also be lost here. Point Mrs. Sophie promised, as long as Ajani serves Franz wholeheartedly, she and her husband will be reunited in 10 years, and give them a sum of money to go to South America, a place where no one can find them. What Ajani saw and heard around Franz told her that the top management of the Polish nationalist army was a joke, and most people just went around cheating and drinking in the name of the Polish nationalist army. Point those self-righteous guys are simply a bunch of retarded people compared to the brat in front of them. Point. And even if she wanted to return to the Polish Restoration Army now, I'm afraid it would be impossible. Because no one would believe her, and instead she might be hanged as a traitor. Franz saw Ajani's dilemma and said, Ajani, you can let Mr. Sinner screen the important information for you. There is no need to report everything to you, which will make both of you tired, and Mr. Sinner's subordinates should be better at handling this kind of thing. If they can't handle it well, it proves that they are not qualified enough to do the job, and they will just need to be replaced at that time. In fact, Franz did not expect that the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry, a semi-commercial and semi-intelligence organization, could really provide much information. After all, businessmen still like to make their own money. Point. The value of this organization is that it makes the Rothschild family lose their rise in Austria. After all, there are not many organizations that can engage in speculative profiteering in the Austrian Empire in this era. Point. At the same time, this organization is also convenient for Franz to guide the business group to develop in the direction he wants. Ajani let out a sigh of relief. To be honest, she had wanted to do this for a long time, but she was a little afraid that Franz would think she was not capable. If you have any ideas, just tell me. After all, I don't know what problems I will encounter when my plan is actually implemented. If you don't speak up, the problem will not be solved, and you will only be affected. Ajani clasped her hands together and nodded, as if she understood, and was very grateful. Point. At this time Thalia read an important piece of news, and Franz knew that the war was about to begin. The United Kingdom signed a new commercial treaty with the Ottoman government, stipulating that the Ottoman Empire government's tariff on imported goods shall not exceed 5%, and the tariff on exported goods shall not exceed 12%. All monopoly systems in the Ottoman Empire will be abolished, and foreigners have the right to operate in the Ottoman Empire. Free business within the territory. Obviously, this empire includes Egypt. Once the Anglo-Turkish commercial treaty is implemented, Egypt's economy will completely collapse. It is so cruel. Point. You must know that Muhammad Ali's fortune was entirely dependent on this monopoly system. Without the monopoly system, Egypt's income would have been reduced by more than 80%. Egypt's exports mainly rely on cotton, tobacco, and indigo, while its internal exploitation relies on sugar and salt. Point. If foreigners can go to Egypt to open stores, then no one will care about the high-priced goods in Egyptian government stores. As for export goods, they will be snapped up by foreign businessmen. After all, cotton and indigo are important raw materials for the textile industry at this time, and they are lacking in Europe. Point. Muhammad Ali could not sit back and watch this happen, so the war between Turkey and Egypt was inevitable. Now Franz is just curious which side will take action first. Egypt, Manio Palace. Point. As soon as the Ottoman envoy finished reading the Sultan's decree, Muhammad Ali drew out his scimitar and walked towards him. Regardless of the other party's plea for mercy, he raised his scimitar and stabbed the envoy in the abdomen. Point. Soon, the envoy from Ottoman fell in a pool of blood, and the smell of blood filled the entire palace. Arsehole. I declare independence now. What do I think Mahmud II and his toy soldiers can do to me? I can't wait to see the panic on the faces of those damn British guys. But his eldest son Ibrahim quickly raised objections. If we become independent, it will be tantamount to violating the previous Q-Tahir agreement, which will make us passive. If the Russians take this opportunity to violate the secret agreement between us again, I'm afraid the French will also retreat. Although Ibrahim was known as the executioner from hell, after seeing the cruelty of the Russian army, he was frightened and did not want to fight this army to his death. So there was a secret agreement between Egypt and Russia. Foreign Minister Abdullah also said, "Great, Ali, we can declare that we refuse to recognize the British-Turkish trade treaty, and at the same time we will no longer pay tribute." Then, how can Egypt be independent? Muhammad Ali roared, "Great, Ali, we are actually independent." Abdul said. Muhammad Ali slapped Abdullah in the face. "War. I want war. I can immediately send a group of people pretending to be Ottoman troops to carry out looting in Syria so that we can blame the Ottomans for starting the war." "Arsehole. Not now. My ship isn't built yet." Muhammad Ali's face was almost touching Abdul's face, and Abdul could only kneel on the ground and whisper, "Whenever you want war, I will send people to fight." In his later years, Ali's energy was much less than before, and he was always looking for drugs that could rejuvenate him. Recently, a traveling Arab businessman brought him a magical wine, which not only made people energetic, but also made people forget all their sorrows. But the side effect is that once you leave this kind of wine, people will become manic, hysterical, and even have red eyes and muscle twitches. Ibrahim immediately opened the wine cabinet, and an unpleasant smell came out as soon as the lid was opened. However, Muhammad Ali looked very intoxicated and no longer restless. Instead, he asked his eldest son to pour yourself a glass. After drinking a glass of opium wine, Muhammad Ali breathed a sigh of relief. "Stupid Sultan, he must not have thought that I have given him a big gift. Don't the British like to protest? Let them protest and immediately declare that Egypt will not accept the Ottoman decree. Any foreign businessman who dares to set foot in Egypt will land. All teeth will be knocked out and beards will be burned." Burning your beard is a very serious form of humiliation in the Arab world. There is nothing to worry about. We just need to wait for the opportunity. After all, Egypt will become stronger and stronger, while the Ottoman Empire and Britain will only become weaker and weaker. It is they who should be anxious. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 143 from Bavaria. First, Lorben was a simple Bavarian farmer who worked hard on the barren land just for the food and clothing of his family. But only 2 of Fista's 6 children survived. He did not complain about anyone and was still grateful that he was still alive. However, this year, drought first caused plants to wither, lakes to dry up, and some people were even heated to death. The seedlings in the ground cannot be saved, and hungry stones keep appearing in the river. The church is packed with people every day. Some of them want to say goodbye to their loved ones, and some of them are at a loss and can only pray for God to send rain as soon as possible. During the rainy season, heavy downpours arrive as scheduled. Before people have time to celebrate, the rain turns into a disaster under the continuous erosion of heavy rain. The withered vegetation could no longer bind the loose soil and eventually turned into a flash flood. After the monstrous flood, everything on the earth was destroyed, including houses, trees, fields, and livestock. The homeless victims were in urgent need of help. However, Bavarian officials said that the government had no money and could only lend the victims a small amount of food. As far as the eye can see, the fields are filled with mourning, ruins, and the corpses of people and animals have not been collected. A plague soon broke out, and even the parish priest died of the disease. First, Lorben had to flee his hometown with the living people and came to Munich. However, the citizens did not welcome these refugees, and they had to beg to survive until someone said, "We can't survive here anyway, let's try our luck in Austria." There is a special carriage for refugees on the train, and you can get on the train by paying half the price. It is said that the Austrian royal family takes special care of the refugees. It's just that the refugee carriage was very simple. The small space was crowded with victims from all German states. There were only 2 rows of seats facing each other. However, those seats had long been occupied by some strong and fierce looking people. The first stop for the refugees was Salzburg, which is an important border defense town in Austria. As soon as the car door opened, the refugees saw a group of fierce-looking officers. The leading officer shouted, "Anyone who is willing to join the Austrian Imperial Army must come to my place for 100 florins a year, including food and lodging." The package of food and accommodation is very attractive to refugees. However, very few can pass the military physical examination because there are too many people who want to eat this bowl of rice. Fortunately, there are still many opportunities. The second stop was Linz. There were many factories here, and the salary was very good, but it was said to be very tiring. The third stop was Vienna, the capital of the Austrian Empire. The station had a temporary rest area set up by the church, where the refugees could take a hot bath and eat Holy Communion, provided by the church. At the same time, the church requires the refugees to fill in a registration form and register their personal information. These will then be sent to the Austrian Imperial Government and the Vienna Chamber of Commerce and Industry respectively. They will usually receive a reply within a week. Of course, the refugees can also find their own information in Vienna. Work. There are many Bavarians in Vienna. After all, Bavaria and Austria are not far apart. They are both Catholic and have similar languages, but their incomes are very different. The revenue of the Kingdom of Bavaria in 1830 was 34.8 million florins, which was only 1/4 of the Austrian Empire during the same period. Moreover, the upper class in Bavaria was corrupt and extravagant, and corrupt officials were rampant. Ludwig I and his mistresses even brought the entire court to its knees. It was a mess. The city seems to have not been affected by the food crisis, and the streets are still very bustling. This is mainly due to the government's relief bill, which allows the poor to find jobs and support themselves without having to abandon their dignity to beg for charity from others. There are many wandering artists in Vienna's parks. Some of them portrait people, draw greeting cards, and some play musical instruments to entertain the public. They work hard for their ideals, and no one will look down on them if they rely on their ability to earn a living. The Habsburg royal family simply built some simple houses near the park for these wandering artists to live in. Of course, not everyone can enter. At least you have to prove that you are indeed an artist. As for how to prove it, of course it is to draw a picture, sing a song, or play a piece of music. Sometimes the royal family and the government would also issue some tasks to these wandering artists, allowing them to perform in specific places. Although the salary is very limited, it is also an opportunity for them to show themselves, and most wandering artists will accept it. First Laubin quickly found an organization called the Bavarian Mutual Aid Association. Under their advice, First Laubin decided to participate in the construction of the Danube Dam first. After all, the salary was high. And as a disaster victim, First Laubin understands the importance of dams better. If his hometown had a strong enough dam, maybe he would not become a refugee. But there are no ifs. At this time, he just hopes that more people will not lose their loved ones and become homeless due to floods at the construction site of the dam. The heads of the imperial government and important figures from the royal family appeared one after another. Their speeches emphasized the importance of the dam and encouraged the workers to continue this great cause that would benefit the present and future generations. He also promised all the workers that, as long as they worked hard and completed their daily workload, they could stay in Austria and work in the royal estate after the project was completed. At this time, the royal estates in various German countries had an unparalleled appeal to farmers, because they could enjoy many rights by entering the royal estates, and at least they no longer had to worry about being able to afford medical treatment. Moreover, the land is fertile, taxes are low, and income is high. In fact, the tax rate on imperial grain is not low, but it makes people feel very comfortable without exorbitant taxes. Plague usually occurs in places like labor camps, but in dozens of labor camps, few people get sick. Not only that, even after the flood, no large-scale epidemic was heard in Austria. This confused First Laubin. In fact, it is not difficult to explain, because the diet of all workers is managed uniformly, the food is fresh, and the water is heated after being disinfected with bleach. The government and the church regularly deal with sanitation issues in the labor camps, allowing workers to take showers and disinfecting the labor camps at the same time. A large number of doctors also volunteered to join the medical team organized by the royal family to treat Workers, there are also strict regulations on the workers' work and rest, and soldiers are responsible for managing the discipline of the labor camp, which also avoids the birth of labor bosses, of course. Entertainment is also an indispensable item in Austria. Opera is obviously not suitable here, and professional actors cannot be hired. Using third-rate actors may be counterproductive. After all, Franz also plans to take the opportunity to carry out a wave of patriotic education. As a result, those painters and musicians in Vienna parks came in handy, and soon there were tens of thousands of paintings depicting the Austrian people's determination to build dams, and a few of the outstanding paintings made the headlines of major Austrian newspapers. It not only promoted the Austrian Empire, but also solved the painters' livelihood. Problem: the music aspect was much more chaotic. These musicians usually worked independently, harassed each other, and blamed each other. Franz originally wanted them to work together to create a song or a piece of music. However, reality told Franz that that was simply impossible. Therefore, the construction site is full of all kinds of music, which may be good to listen to alone, but when mixed together, it is a deadly noise. Franz sighed. It seems that I can only unify these discordant tones. Chapter 144. Against the waves of thousands of years. Franz immediately thought of a song, and it happened that Johann Strauss Sr. was conducting the orchestra at a charity ball held by the Vienna government. "Mr. Strauss, someone is looking for you," a young musician said. "Didn't you see that I was performing? Do you know where this place is? Any big shot here can make you completely disappear from this world. How dare you disturb me? Believe it or not, I will fire you now." Although Johann Strauss Sr. was born as a commoner, he had already become famous for a long time. He even made a special performance at Queen Victoria's coronation ceremony. He is no longer the young boy who first arrived in Vienna wearing only a white undershirt and a violin. At this time, Johann Strauss Sr. was more like a businessman than a musician. Businessmen naturally put profits first, and the powerful people in front of him were very likely to be his potential customers. After all, the cost of his orchestra was very high, and ordinary businessmen and nobles simply couldn't afford it. "I'm sorry to disturb your performance." Jenny opened her mouth to help the aggrieved young man. The young musician glanced at Jenny gratefully, and Jenny smiled and winked at him. Some of Jenny's unconscious little movements can easily cause misunderstandings. The young musician lowered his head shyly. Old Johann Strauss also noticed that the woman in front of him had the mature charm of a young woman, as well as the naughty and agile spirit of a girl. She was dressed luxuriously and capable. The experienced John immediately analyzed that the woman in front of him was either the mistress of a big shot or the attendant of a big shot, and was not an ordinary woman. This kind of person will cause big trouble for himself if he is not handled well. So old John Strauss immediately put on a smiling face and asked respectfully, "Hello, madam, how may I help you?" "You are Mr. Johann Strauss. Your performance is very wonderful. Archduke Franz Joseph wants to see you. Please be sure to appreciate it." Jenny handed over the invitation and said goodbye. First, Jenny had someone else to invite. Second, she didn't like the look in the man's eyes. And third, she was sure that the other person would go to the appointment, so she didn't want to waste time. Old Johann Strauss knew who Franz Joseph was without looking at the invitation. "Is Archduke Franz also a fan of mine?" Old Johann Strauss couldn't help but feel a little proud. 3 days later, Vienna, Royal Garden. Old Johann Strauss specially changed into his favorite suit and asked his wife to take care of his hair carefully to ensure that he would look his best when meeting Archduke Franz. Maybe from now on he can become a court musician like Mozart. Although his band is very profitable now, he will be more famous and profitable after becoming a court musician. Old Johann Strauss knew this very well, so he came to the royal gardens with confidence. But he seemed to be late. A long table was already full. Old John Strauss knew all these people, including Chopin, Liszt, Robert Schumann, Carl Czerny, Paganini, and Berlioz. Archduke John of Lyons, except for the dead and the unborn. All the big names in the music scene in the 19th century were basically gathered together. Of course, if it weren't for Vienna, if it weren't for the help of Archduke John and Jenny, Franz wouldn't be able to hire so many people. First of all, Chopin was very dissatisfied with the Austrian Empire. Fortunately, Jenny and Chopin had a good personal relationship. They both participated in the Warsaw Uprising and went into exile in Paris together. Later, they joined the Polish Restoration Army to fight for Poland, so it will only appear here today. Although Archduke John was somewhat unreliable, he was a failure. To study music with Beethoven, was defrauded of tens of millions by doing business with the Rothschild family, fought with Napoleon, and almost made Archduke Karol angry to death when he let him go. But I have to say that his reputation is really great. And the title of Beethoven's disciple is very useful. Everyone, including Czerny and Liszt, has to give him face. Franz was tone deaf, so naturally he had to leave it to a Czerny to hum a minor tune. In fact, a Czerny's musical literacy is very good, but unfortunately Franz's level is too poor, and she cannot completely reproduce the melody of the song. Some of the music masters present closed their eyes to listen, some took out pens and paper to draw music scores. Some were already playing the beat with their hands, and some were playing accompaniment with tableau. Even before a Czerny finished humming it for the first time, these music masters had already found the proper melody of the piece. As a result, under their guidance, a Czerny actually hummed the passages that Franz had forgotten. In just a few minutes, the complete score of that song was completed. After that, Liszt and Chopin sat in front of the piano, and Paganini and others picked up the violin, and all the masters played a song together. The effect was very shocking, but a Czerny's humming made people feel like a love song. After the song, Berlioz was the first to speak. Archduke Franz, it's quite good to have such a level at 8 years old. Don't feel inferior, Franz sighed in his heart. No wonder you will be poor all your life. You are so good at talking. At this time, someone proposed to write lyrics for Franz's music, but Franz flatly refused. In Franz's mind, those European composers were okay, but the level of lyrics was really poor. It was either love or love, or it was just red flowers and green grass. Ever since, Franz took out the Austrian version of the lyrics that he had already revised. The Holy Roman Empire lasted for thousands of years. Elbe, Rhine, Danube, Po, East and North flows. Zhangzi nourishes all nations, but the troubles never end. Eternal breeding and nourishing China and Europe, but he is dangerous and unstable, and his moodiness threatens all directions water can carry. A boat on a long voyage, it can also turn over clouds and rain to create evil waves. The truth is that natural disasters are unpredictable and difficult to prevent. It's just a matter of fighting with one's life and using one's body as an obstacle to make one feel miserable. Standing in the West, the masters had different expressions after reading the lyrics. They had never seen such weird lyrics. There were so many grammatical errors that it was appalling. The style was more like a long poem than lyrics. Several German musicians burst into tears after watching it. Although it was about flooding, it was more like a history of the German nation, telling about the turmoil, restlessness, and hesitation that this nation had experienced, but never surrendered and continued to strive and keep moving forward. Whether it was a natural disaster or the brutal attacks of the French and Ottomans, countless ancestors fought for their lives. Among them were civilians and nobles, men, and women. These people have been swallowed up by history, but it is their contribution that has made a difference for others. People fight for life. Although the tone is slightly tragic, the whole song is filled with the spirit of never giving up and depicts a future of self-reliance, self-respect, and confidence for the German people. The one who cried the most miserably was Chopin. Although the article was full of great German thoughts, the Ottomans and the flood reminded him of his motherland, Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that once stood alone in suppressing the Jew and penetrated the Ottomans. Some people had a heavy heart. They saw an ambitious monarch and a terrifying big German idea. It had nothing to do with faith or character. This young man would surely cause countless bloody storms in Europe. Archduke Franz, what is the name of this song? A Thousand Years Against the Waves. I haven't thought about this lyric, but it will definitely mention the Napoleonic Wars, the Siege of Vienna, the Augsburg Water Conservancy System. Please vote. Chapter 145 Worries about the future. Austria, Danube dams. The melody of Back to the Waves is passionate, and the lyrics, although slightly sad, lack a lot of unnecessary moaning, and are more likely to resonate with German workers. The whole song is full of great German ideas, but it never mentions Germany, only the Holy Roman Empire and Austria. Even the wandering entertainers who play the music may not understand the true meaning of the song. The Danube Dam was successfully completed, and First Lorben chose to reclaim wasteland for the royal estate. He was accompanied by many Germans who were allotted the same piece of land. The royal family gave them food and tools, but they had to carve out a land of their own on their own. After the dam was completed, some workers returned to their original countries with the money they earned from working, but what they brought back was not just money. Ottoman Empire, Istanbul. Palmerston never expected that Muhammad Ali would be so shameless. He clearly did not abide by Ottoman laws, but he had the nerve to say that he was an Ottoman minister, and that Egypt was not independent. And the Ottomans are really capable. Even though the Egyptians are scared, they just don't dare to send troops. In fact, only Britain and France cared about the troubles between the Ottomans and Egypt at first. Russia was watching the show, Prussia was indifferent, and Austria was studying which side to place its bets on. Although the Austrian Empire is heavily in debt, its fiscal revenue is much higher than at the same time in history. At this time, the fiscal revenue of the Austrian Empire was 216 million florins, compared with 140.61 million florins at the same time in history. Prince Metternich hopes to use this Near East crisis to expand his influence in the Near East. Of course, he does not want to compete with Russia for hegemony, but rather he wants to continue to maintain relations with Russia. Because he knew that the Tsar would not sympathize with the weak, but would only respect the strong. The treaties signed by Russia and the weak were as pale as paper. If you want to become Russia's ally, you must be strong enough. Moreover, for centuries, Serbia has been stuck in Austria's throat like a fishbone, preventing the Austrian Empire from advancing or retreating in the Balkan direction. The key to the Balkans is the gateway to Central Europe. Walking out of the Fruška Mountains from Serbia and crossing the Danube River is the Vojvodina Plain. Vojvodina in turn connects the Croatian and Hungarian plains. The Ottomans used this road when they besieged Vienna twice, which made the Austrians always resent this area. But in general, Metternich felt that it would be more beneficial for Austria to maintain the status quo of the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, or that the powers would carve up the Ottomans together, and Austria would take the opportunity to solve its Balkan worries. Compared to the Balkans and the German regions, Prince Metternich wanted to continue the late emperor's last wish and let the Austrian Empire rule the Apennine Peninsula. Count Korolov hopes to join forces with Britain to completely defeat France, which is the best choice. Of course, he did not hope to open trade with Egypt. As a Croatian, he had no desire to rescue his fellow Slavs trapped in the Balkans. Count Korolov even sneered at the cowards in Italy. What he wanted was to completely exclude French power from southern Germany, take the opportunity to bring it into Austria's sphere of influence, and then annex it when the time was right. In fact, there is a third faction, that is, the military leaders headed by Count Latter. They feel that the Ottoman Empire is in decline and they should take the opportunity to launch a Turkish-Austrian war, just like the Russians did, expanding Austria's territory and marching into the Balkans. It would be best to capture the two Danube principalities, so that Russia's road to the Balkans can be completely cut off, and the Austrian Empire can dominate the Balkans. For this reason, they designed a variety of combat plans Franz called the third type, a death-seeking faction. Not to mention that Wallachia and Moldavia were Russian protectorates. Would Britain and France agree to Austria sending troops to the two Danube principalities? At this time, the five major European powers, except Prussia, all had ambitions for the Ottoman Empire, and they would never sit back and watch Austria monopolize the Balkans. The result of the disagreement between Metternich and Count Korolov was that the Regency Council was in a state of uproar, while the Austrian military secretly mobilized troops and distributed supplies. As a result, Russia and the Ottoman Empire responded quickly. The three countries gathered hundreds of thousands of troops near the Carpathian Mountains, resulting in a serious shortage of troops on the southern front of the Ottoman Empire. Palmerston looked at the situation in front of him and was very upset. How could things become like this? The Anglo-Turkish Commercial Treaty did not bring much benefit to Britain. Through the Anglo-Turkish Treaty of Commerce, Britain wanted to obtain not the Ottoman Empire's market, but the Egyptian cotton origin. Of course, it's not that the Ottoman Empire's market is not big enough, but that after Britain, European countries have signed business contracts with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire based on the principle of don't worry if there are too many lice, signed new commercial treaties with European countries very smoothly. As a result, goods from various European countries poured into the Ottoman Empire. Although it dealt a heavy blow to the Ottoman Empire's own industry and commerce, the increase in import and export taxes gave the Ottomans an illusion of prosperity. For Britain, this is not what they want. Britain's industrial level ranks first in the world, but it cannot stand up to the shamelessness of other European countries. The crazy trade war has made British businessmen no longer want to do business in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, it was not just Palmerston who was upset at this time. Mehmed II was also very upset. The protagonists of this Near East crisis should have been Egypt and the Ottomans. However, I don't know why the Austrian Empire and Russia suddenly gathered heavy troops in the north. The Ottoman Empire could not withstand the joint attack of Austria and Russia in any case. All it could do was send troops to garrison in the north, saying that it would never give in easily, and hope that the other side would retreat in spite of difficulties. Palmerston and Mehmed II both let out a long sigh, and then Mehmed II spoke first. Mr. Palmerston, why are Russia and Austria gathering heavy troops near the Carpathian Mountains? The responses from both countries are normal movements and they have no intention of attacking your country. Palmerston replied calmly, although he himself did not believe this statement. Then, can your country guarantee the territorial security of our country under the joint attack of Austria and Russia? Mehmed II continued to ask. To be honest, if Austria and Russia join forces, it is impossible to meet their opponents in the Balkans. But Palmerston still said with a smile, Great Sultan, please rest assured that we in the UK are the most powerful country in the world and no one can defeat us. What about Russia, France, and Austria joining forces? Mehmed II continued to ask, what do you mean? Don't you trust us in Britain? Palmerston asked, please forgive me, I just want to ensure the security of my country. I do not intend to go to war with Egypt until Austria and Russia withdraw their troops. Mehmed II made it clear that he did not want to take any chances. Palmerston also wanted to know what Russia and Austria were planning to do, so he decided to go to Russia and Austria. Chapter 146, a good start and a failed one. Russia, St. Petersburg. Nasrallah is the ultimate British bastard. Although he is the Russian foreign minister, he is actually a pro-British faction. Historically, it was precisely because of his wrong judgment that not only directly destroyed Russia's advantages accumulated over decades, but even indirectly led to Russia's defeat in the Crimean War. In fact, the Tsar himself was not very fond of Britain, especially after Queen Victoria came to the throne. He believed that the British army, which was raised under women's skirts, was not qualified to compare with his army, which was tempered in the ice and snow. However, it was this kind of contempt that made the Tsar believe that joining Britain and France could restore the glory of the empire and even retake Constantinople. Palmerston was invited to attend Nasrallah's private banquet. After a few glasses of wine, Nasrallah completely exposed Russia's bottom line. This made Palmerston very satisfied, because the intelligence further confirmed his so-called Russian threat theory. Of course, the current situation is that Britain really needs Russia, at least it cannot let Russia fall to the side of France. At the same time, he also hinted to Nasrallah that Britain intended to form an alliance with Russia to carve up the Ottoman Empire. However, the Winkarai-Scalisi Treaty was an obstacle to cooperation between the two countries. As long as Russia gave up Russia and Turkey alliance, everything is negotiable. Finally, Palmerston arrived at the Russian palace and asked Tsar Nicholas I face to face about the garrison in the Carpathian Mountains. Nicholas I said that it was to prevent the Austrians from attacking the two Danube principalities, because the Austrian Empire suddenly increased its troops in Transylvania. This situation is extremely unusual, and there is intelligence claiming that a large amount of weapons, ammunition, and food have been sent to Transylvania. Knowing that the Austrian Empire is experiencing a famine, it may want to launch a foreign war to divert domestic conflicts. Palmerston was not very impressed with Austria as a country, and he even scorned Metternich personally. He felt that those traditional politicians should have been buried long ago. Modern politics is about effectiveness and efficiency. There is no need for a diplomat to spend several months understanding the other party's background, hobbies, and resume. As long as he knows what he wants, and what the other party wants. It is enough point of course. He had to go to Austria. After all, Austria at this time was still the nominal defender of the European order. Austria Vienna, Your Majesty Prime Minister, I think you should know what a bad impact the sudden appearance of the Austrian Empire's troops in Transylvania will have. This is a kind of destruction of regional peace. This is Prince Metternich opened the wine cabinet and did not pay attention to Palmerston's words. In fact, Metternich had kept Palmerston waiting for 4 days before this. First, he did not like Palmerston's attitude. Secondly, this was just a private act by a British diplomat, who even had the right to refuse contact with Palmerston. Again, he needed enough time to figure out the ins and outs of the matter, and he also wanted to know what Palmerston was going to do. Excuse me, I have vodka and white wine here. Which one do you like? Palmerston was very unhappy with Prince Metternich's innocuous attitude, but he could not boss the Austrian Prime Minister around like he did to the Ottoman Grand Vizier, so he could only speak patiently. Your Excellency, you haven't answered my question yet, dear Mr. Palmerston. Don't call me Prince, just call me Metternich. I didn't answer your question, but you didn't answer mine either. Let's make it even. But, Mr. Metternich, I insist that I ask the question first. Does it matter? This is very important. The purpose of my coming here is to know why the Austrian Empire has to deploy troops on the border. But this is my home, and you are my guest. Palmerston felt speechless for a while. He didn't expect that the other party would be like this. It seemed that he could only meet the other party's request first, but he was not interested in white wine or vodka. Just give me a glass of rum. We don't have the wine you asked for. Although Prince Metternich spoke calmly, his intention to banish guests was already obvious. Palmerston stood up and left angrily, and Prince Metternich looked at his leaving back and said, Berger, send Viscount Palmerston off for me. Palmerston did not stop and quickly left Metternich's house. Metternich picked up the glass of white wine on the table and drank it in one gulp. Children. Playhouse. Prince Metternich already understood the ins and outs of the matter. At the same time, he also knew that Palmerston only represented him personally, not the official attitude of the British government. Regarding Palmerston's question, no matter what the answer is, combined with the subsequent actions, it will be interpreted as an attitude of the Austrian Empire. At this moment, what the Austrian Empire needs most is to maintain the status quo, so it is better not to answer. Of course, even if it is an official visit, it is not the turn of other countries to intervene in the actions of the Austrian Empire on its own soil. This necessary toughness is a necessary means to maintain the image of Austria as a great power. However, stationing troops in Transylvania was obviously not in line with his policy of uniting Russia to resist France, so he suggested that the military could station troops in Nordsavy. As for the conditions for Austria's annexation of Serbia, it could be exchanged for Austria's support for Russia's annexation of the two Danube principalities. The opposition of the Ottomans was of no value to Russia and Austria, and Metternich always believed that France was the biggest enemy of the Austrian Empire. The most important thing is that it is not time to place a bet yet for the Austrian Empire. Palmerston was very angry. As the British Foreign Secretary, he had never been so insulted. However, no matter how angry he was, he could not start a war just because the other party refused to give him a drink. Moreover, Austria is different from other countries in that the coastline is too short. Blocking the coastal area will not have much impact on this country. Its economy does not depend on the ocean. If a war started on land, it would be tantamount to being an enemy of the Holy Alliance. Fortunately, he also heard that Prince Metternich had a mortal enemy. Viscount Palmerston and Count Korolev hit it off immediately. There is not much cognitive difference between the two. To borrow Palmerston's famous saying, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests, fighting. France is the common interest of Britain and Austria, but withdrawing troops from Transylvania will affect the interests of the Austrian Empire. People hate losses. Count Korolev said that he had a way to get the Austrian army to leave Transylvania, but he needed Palmerston to show some sincerity. However, Palmerston thought wrong. He thought this was a good opportunity for 5 kills. Palmerston immediately expressed his willingness to support the Austrian Empire in seizing the two Danube principalities after the war. In this way, he would first use the Holy Alliance to kill France and Egypt, and then use Ottoman lands to cause conflict between Austria and Russia. Britain would reap the benefits. Just perfect. Count Korolov was obviously dissatisfied. It was not that he saw the sinister calculation in it, but that he was insensitive to Palmerston's generosity. At the same time, this was not the sincerity he wanted. Please vote, comment, and support. Chapter 147 Invitation from Central America. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. In the royal chapel, Archbishop Prussia sat opposite Franz. The archbishop had a completely new look, and all the decorations were replaced with rubies, especially the 9-ring set with rubies that were really eye-catching. Archbishop Prussia opened a box, which was filled with red and blue gems. These gems have been polished and can be set directly in the jewelry shop. What Franz didn't know was that these gems were actually of the highest quality, and their total price should be around 3 million florins. As for those in not so good condition, they were sold directly to jewelry stores. Most of these were found in Chandler according to your instructions, Archduke Franz, and some were donated by believers. The diocese has expanded to 8 provinces, and I believe that it will not be long before the entire territory of Chandler is liberated. It is obvious that the church's support for Chandler has played a great role. Rubber trees have been widely planted in areas controlled by the church, but it is still a few years away from official production. At present Chandler's income is far less than the church's investment, but Franz still has a way. The church can consider taking back the silver mines in northern Chandler to cover daily expenses, but those silver mines are in the hands of the Siamese. Siam is a big country with a population of 8 million. Although we have ceased war with the Vietnamese, if we go to war with Siam, Vietnam will most likely take advantage of the situation to counterattack. Siam and Vietnam are at war, so we may not have enough troops. Prussia said with some embarrassment that the Austrian church had made a great contribution to Chandler, not only in terms of financial resources, but also in sending many capable and loyal believers. Don't worry, Archbishop. The Siamese don't have the courage, and fighting is not just about numbers. Indulgence notes can be used now, but they can no longer be used after the French come. Large transactions are exchanged for Austrian expected banknotes. Use white lead money for small amounts. The church used indulgences as currency in Chandler with the purpose of extorting the wealth of the Chandler region. However, this kind of thing is very easy to be copied. The Chandler people, Vietnamese, and Siamese cannot copy it. It does not represent Europe with advanced technology. Neither can humans. In order to maintain long-term peace and stable development in the region, it is necessary to use anti-counterfeiting banknotes with a higher degree of security. At the same time, white lead money is a currency of little value, and has no value in counterfeiting. In fact, the Siamese people did not have the courage. The British invasion of Burma showed the Siamese people the power of the West. At this time, the King of Siam was trying his best to avoid all conflicts with the West. Of course, as Archbishop Prussia expected, the Vietnamese thought this was an opportunity to organize a counterattack. Of course, the outcome was a disastrous defeat, and they had to continue to cede territory and pay compensation. Archduke Franz, these gems are of good quality. I hope they can help you. In fact, the best quality ruby is Burmese ruby, but the real wax ruby is so similar to it that it can be mistaken for the real thing in the eyes of laymen. Although the British occupied Burma, they did not have strong control over the local area. In addition, the output of Burmese rubies was not high, so the ruby market was not controlled by the British, which gave Austria an opportunity to take advantage of it. After all, Chandler's rubies have a high output and good quality. As long as they don't put in too much, they can maintain high prices. The red and sapphire gems in this box are enough to make an ordinary person crazy. For ordinary people in this era, even if they don't eat or drink, it will take tens of thousands of years to afford the gems in the box. However, in Franz's eyes, they are of little value. They are just some decorations. The output is much lower than diamonds, and the market recognition is not as good as diamonds. The money-making effect is very poor. It is better to win the silver mine. But for the old magician to come up with so much, he must be asking for help from Franz. Archbishop, what brings you here today? Please tell me. The Central American Federation is experiencing a rebellion, and countless innocent people have been massacred. War, plague, and famine are raging in that land. Civilization is being brutally expelled, and the people there need your help. The rebellion in the Central American Federation was entirely caused by the insistence of former President Ramazan. It is obviously a conservative stronghold, and must carry out liberal reforms. It would be nice if he was gentler, but this president's methods are extremely brutal, and his opponents may be exiled or executed at worst. Ramazan admired French ideas and strictly enforced the Napoleonic Code, but most Central Americans did not understand the law at all. There were more people waiting for execution in front of the market than citizens in the market. He was also very simple and direct in his treatment of the church. He abolished tithes, confiscated church property, exiled missionaries, demolished monasteries, and allowed nuns to return to secular life. At the same time, he followed Napoleon in establishing the St. C Military Academy, followed Emperor Sui Yang in digging the Nicaragua Grand Canal, and forcibly conquered the native Indians. He liked micromanaging, and almost never won his own wars. In short, he was addicted to food. At the beginning of the rebellion, there were only a few thousand native Indians in the rebel army, armed with spears and wooden sticks. Ramazan led an army of 20,000 people and a swineherd to fight back and forth. A year later, the number of rebels had grown to hundreds of thousands, so-called, occupying almost all of Guatemala. Morazan had no troops to send, so all the countries in the Central American Federation declared independence one after another. Mexico once wanted to use troops to annex the Central American Federation, but was warned by Britain and France. The Americans also reiterated the Monroe Declaration, although it was of no use. Obviously, the fragmentation of Central America is more in the interests of the great powers. Only the president of Nicaragua still supports the Federation, but he does not have enough strength and appeal. Archbishop, as far as I know, President Ramazan is very opposed to the church, and has almost zero tolerance for religion. Moreover, he himself is the source of unrest. Why should you help him, Archduke? Franz, what you saw is just what the newspaper said. Europeans do not care about the life and death of Central Americans. The war in the Central American Federation has evolved into a massacre against white people. The white people in Guatemala, the population has dropped by 30%, and the church cannot continue to sit idly by. In fact, the massacre of white people was instigated by the church. The church, which was forced into desperation by Morazan, took advantage of the outbreak of plague in Guatemala and spread the word in the indigenous villages that Morazan sent people to poison the water. As a result, this uprising against the liberal government soon turned into a massacre targeting white people and all privileged classes. Although the church priests escaped, there is a saying that the rabbit dies and the fox is sad. Most of the church's missionaries were white. Although the mob restored the church's land, it could not give the priests any sense of security. As expected, massacres and robberies targeting priests occurred in some areas, which made the churches in Central America even more panicked. Both liberals and conservatives want to restore order, but they have found the wrong person. Extreme liberals like Morazan are not only unable to do this task, but will also make things worse. Even if order is temporarily restored with the help of external forces, the Central American Federation will fall apart sooner or later. Chapter 148, Invitation from Central America. Franz personally feels that in fact, in such a backward and conservative area, the imperial system may be more reliable. Why didn't the church choose to support a conservative, or a king? Franz asked. Are you willing to help them? Rorschach asked with some confusion. I don't want to. Is this what you mean? Or the Central American priests? Franz replied. Archbishop Rorschach also noticed his gaffe and immediately changed the subject. I made a mistake. But no one among the conservatives has enough influence, let alone an orthodox European royal who is willing to go to Central America to be the king. Rorschach said. In fact, if you think about it, you will know that not to mention Central America, even North America was once considered a barbaric land by Europeans. Throughout history, there were very few European royal members who were willing to go to Central and North America to become kings. That's why Franz's second brother, Maximilian, is so famous. Then let them pay for mercenaries. Carrera's main force is just some untrained Indians, and most of the weapons are antiques from the Spanish colonial period. A well-trained mercenary team can completely help China the American Federation put down the rebellion, but whether the Central American Federation can continue to maintain it depends on their own determination. The Central American Federation includes the 5 participating countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. They are nothing more than the legacy of the Spanish colonial empire. The Central American Federation was a country that should not exist. When Mexico declared its independence in 1821, it announced the annexation of the 5 Central American countries. At the same time, the 5 Central American countries announced their joining and loyalty to the Mexican Emperor later. Due to the Mexicans' own tricks and endless civil war, the 5 Central American countries became independent and established the Central American Federation. However, the conservative forces in Central America are strong and regionalism is very serious. This, coupled with the radical reforms of the Central American federal government, has greatly intensified the conflicts between regions. It can be said that the current mess is entirely their own fault. Generally speaking, France is opposed to the use of mercenaries. After all, the discipline and loyalty of this kind of army cannot be guaranteed. But the Austrian Empire will never intervene in such a dispute. Even if it wants to do so, it will be shut out like the Mexicans. At least Britain, France and the United States will not agree, and maybe Mexico will be added. Moreover, the rebels are terribly poor, and they probably won't have the money to instigate mercenaries, so they can be used with confidence. But the Central American Federation is not rich. They simply cannot afford the commission, and the federal treasury in Guatemala was looted by Carrera. Rorschach said. At this time, Carrera felt extremely wronged because they only found 400 ounces of gold in the Central American Federal Treasury in Guatemala City, equivalent to £3,342.80. It's very simple. You can use land as collateral in exchange for loans, and then use the loans to hire troops to help them fight the war. This kind of empty-handed approach will definitely satisfy the priests in Central America. As for the result, France doesn't care. The geographical location of Central America is very important, but its value as a colonial development is too low. The main source of economy in Central America relies on agriculture, including corn, sugar, cocoa, and tobacco. But Archbishop Rorschach hesitated to speak, and Franz knew that what came next was what the servant of God really wanted to say. Archbishop, just say what you want without any scruples. If you shouldn't say something, I'll just pretend I didn't hear it. Franz said, if you have any way to establish a diocese in Central America, our church will definitely support you fully. Franz's face changed several times. To be honest, the situation in Central America and Zenla was completely different. Neither the great powers nor the great powers in the Americas would ever allow the church to establish a country in Central America. The price is too high, and it's not the right time. Will the Austrian Empire provide troops? No, you should let them go to the French. The French are now very interested in Central and North America, and the French are also willing to lend them money. In fact, the British were more interested in Central America, but due to religious issues, the French were more suitable to enter Central America than the former. After the French entered Central America, the British had even more reason to oppose the former. At the same time, France will form a trap to outflank Mexico, and will once again trample on the United States Monroe Declaration. For Austria, it was undoubtedly a good thing that the great powers turned their attention to America. Austria could profit from the North American version of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms without being trapped in it like Britain. French. Archbishop Rorschach was a little surprised by Franz's answer. After all, mercenaries are very profitable, and the Austrian Empire has been at peace for a long time, but has a large number of troops. If part of the army can be turned into mercenaries and sent to Central America, it will definitely reduce the pressure on the Austrian Empire's finances. Yes, you can ask the French church to come forward. I think King Louis Philippe will be very willing to give the church this face. There has always been a connection between the Austrian and French churches. Even the last fleet organized by the Austrian church included many French armed merchant ships. If there was no connection between them, Franz would not believe it, even if he killed him. Okay, Archduke Franz, everything goes as you wish. Archbishop Prussia said. Franz pointed to the box on the table, and Archbishop Prussia shook his head. Archduke Franz, I think these gems can play a greater role in your hands. The business of holy water and holy light, medical alcohol and bleaching powder, is enough to fill the vacancies in the church. We will pray to God and ask you can continue to benefit the world. The widespread use of bleaching powder and medical alcohol had a great impact on the Austrian Empire. At least the large-scale cholera epidemic in the Austrian Empire has basically disappeared. The number of deaths from dysentery has also plummeted. The death and disability rate due to trauma has also dropped significantly, and the survival rate of newborns and mothers has continued to rise. Compared with the money earned by the church, Archbishop Prussia was delighted by the return of faith and the improvement of the church's reputation. At the same time, these operations also made his position in the Austrian Empire more stable, and some people were even prepared to let the Pope canonize Prussia. Of course, Prussia himself was not interested in the title he bought from the Pope, and he felt that he should be able to live for many more years and there was no need to worry about the honor that could only be obtained by a dead man. Franz said nothing. He only thought that these gems would benefit the two people in the next room. After Archbishop Prussia left, two heads quietly popped out of the door. Thalia took a plate of snacks and a glass of juice and handed them to Franz, then turned behind Franz and pinched his back. Franz, you are amazing. Ajani, on the other hand, used a sweet voice to express a disgusting exclamation, which sounded a bit strange, mainly because Ajani didn't know what tone to use to speak to Franz at the same time. She looked at Franz with admiration. She was half sincere and the other half was pretending, looking like she was working hard. She really couldn't believe her eyes and ears. After all, in her mind, if the clergy reached the level of the archbishop of a country, it would be difficult for even the king to drive them, and Archbishop Prussia looked more like a saint receiving discipline. Just like a disciple. Okay, you guys can choose for yourself. But remember, leave the biggest one to my mother. Franz sat in his armchair, thoughtful. Ask for votes. Chapter 149. Target Gate of Hell. Austrian Empire, Vienna. After staying for a month, Palmerston finally understood Count Korolev's so-called sincerity. Palmerston reluctantly purchased a work of art from a Jewish businessman for £50,000. Count Korolev said that, since everyone knew so much about art, he wouldn't mind doing this small favor for Palmerston. He assured Palmerston that the Austrian Empire would withdraw its troops within 6 months. This made Palmerston so angry that he wanted to return the artwork on the spot, but he could not find the Jewish businessman. In desperation, Palmerston had to ask Count Korolev to hurry up, and the latter laughed at the former's stinginess and recklessness. There was no way to return the goods, and Palmerston had no evidence. In order not to continue to intensify the conflict, he could only leave Vienna first, hoping that Count Korolev would keep his promise. In fact, Count Korolev did keep his promise. However, what Palmerston did not expect was that the Austrian army just moved from Bukovina to Nordsavy. Bukovina is an important border defense town in Transylvania, and Nordsavy is also an important border defense town in Vojvodina. Graben Street, above the attic of the old Jack's clock shop. Baron Brunel, who held the letter in his hand with some confusion, looked at Thalia and said, Namibia. It was a dead land. Many countries tried to colonize there. First the Dutch, then the Spanish and the Portuguese, but the land there was barren and the indigenous people were savage and warlike and difficult to tame. In 1824, the British gave up the last one, the stronghold of Southwest Africa. It is true that no country is colonizing there now. But who should we buy land from? Who should we sign a treaty with? Explorers. From the age of discovery called Namibia the Gates of Hell. Perhaps because of this name, many people are reluctant to go to Namibia. In fact, the environment of Namibia's eastern plateau is not that harsh, but it is far away from the coastline. Most explorers give up before reaching it. There are only a few missionary stations where Westerners are known to gather, but they are often attacked by indigenous people. The total number of white people in Namibia does not exceed 200, and most of them are missionaries and adventurers. The most important thing is that Namibia's long and narrow coast is covered by desert. The hot and arid climate and the smell of death are intimidating point at the same time. There are many problems in establishing settlements on the coast of Namibia, such as lack of food, water, fuel, and even building materials, and the lack of deep water harbors. Only Walvisport, also known as Whale Bay Point Baron Brook's concerns are very reasonable. But what the world doesn't know is that the coast of Namibia is also known as the Diamond Coast. It has rich diamond reserves and extremely high quality. The largest vein is in Luderitz, however. Luderitz was still a barren desert at this time. If you want to colonize Namibia, you must first occupy the eastern plateau and obtain stable supplies. Does it matter who we sign a treaty with? The total number of the Ovambo, Herero and Mana people does not exceed 50,000, but they have established more than a dozen countries and hundreds of tribes. Maybe they themselves don't know Namibia whose coast should belong to it? Failure said, you mean to make a false statement? No, it was the Austrian Empire that needed a declaration to gain permission to colonize Namibia. But, what's the point? The Austrian Empire does not have a supply point in Namibia. If a supply point is temporarily established, the cost will be very huge, and it may require hundreds of thousands of florins. Here you go. Failure took out a contract and handed it to Baron Brook. Archduke Franz has purchased the ownership of Port Walvis from the British government for £12,000. In fact, after 1824, Britain was forced to abandon Walvisport due to insolvency. The reason was that the nearby Angola and Cape colonies had better deep water harbors and could provide cheap supplies and goods. However, this still did not satisfy Baron Brook, and he continued to ask, but how do we develop this colony in Namibia? We can explore eastward, find areas suitable for colonization on the plateau there, establish settlements, and then send explorers and geologists to explore for resources. This can solve the resource shortage problem in Port Walvis, but who can guarantee that there will be areas suitable for colonization in the eastern plateau? It is full of barbaric and warlike indigenous people, and many missionaries and explorers have lost their lives there. Master Brook, what do you think feeds so many warlike natives? Brook was speechless for a moment. He realized the problem. He only heard the legends about the savage and warlike Namibian indigenous people, but forgot that the indigenous people also needed to eat. Don't worry, Lord Brook. With so many warlike natives, they must have fertile land. Otherwise, where would they have the energy to cross the desert to attack ports and missionary stations? Thalia asked in return. Baron Brook continued to ask like a curious baby, but Namibia is tens of thousands of kilometers away from the Austrian Empire. You can't just let people farm the land, right? And now that the life in the empire is getting better and better, no matter how poor the people are, they are not willing to leave, let alone go to a death zone like Namibia. Failure took out another treasure map and a parchment scroll. The treasure map was drawn by Franz, and the parchment scroll was written by Franz in Latin. There is a treasure map here recording the treasure of Cleopatra 7. Cleopatra, and this parchment record records this history. Baron Brook looked at the treasure map. He could barely tell that it was a pattern of southern Africa, with many X's drawn near Namibia. The sheepskin scroll did look like it had gone through many years, but the ink seemed to be new. Of course, Baron Brook knew that these were all forgeries, but as long as he had these, someone would be willing to go to Namibia, and that was enough. Baron Brook still admired the vision of Archduke Franz, and he wanted to see what treasures were buried in Namibia. Falsifying claims and false propaganda are not difficult. But Baron Brook is worried about the local indigenous people. There are less than 50,000 indigenous people living in Namibia, and most of them make a living by herding. Although there are many people, there are 10 countries, hundreds of tribes, and dozens of languages. The reason why the indigenous people attack ports and missionary stations regardless of the cost is because the white people often rob the cattle and sheep of the indigenous tribes in order to survive. Naturally, they fight desperately for survival. Vienna, Hall of Mirrors. My stupid brother, what are you going to do? Go to a desert to establish a colony? My poor brother, there is still no desert in the Austrian Empire. Shouldn't we make up for the regrets of our ancestors? My stupid brother, if I sent people to colonize a desert I would be laughed at. My poor brother, Are you going to give up on becoming the first emperor to colonize the desert because of others' ridicule? Okay, I'll do whatever you want. Chapter 150 Lingzun. At the beginning of 1839, Lingzun arrived as promised point, because Austria had widened the river before, but Hungary did not widen it in time, and there was heavy rainfall and snowfall in winter, causing ice to accumulate at the bends of the Danube, forming ice dams and reservoirs, causing the water level upstream to rise sharply. Eventually, as the temperature rose, the ice dam burst and freezing floods broke out. In history, this was a huge storm that had not happened in a century. It destroyed half of Budapest. In Budapest alone, thousands of houses were destroyed, and tens of thousands of people were made homeless afterwards. The cold floods flowed freely in the Great Plains of Hungary, destroying countless farmland and houses with devastating force, and did not stop until they returned to the Danube River again. This diversion of the Danube River left hundreds of thousands of people homeless in Hungary. The Hungarian government applied for a relief fund of 200 million florins from the Austrian Imperial government, but was naturally rejected by the Imperial government. The nationwide disaster in 1838 had already saddled the Imperial government with another 200 million florins of debt, bringing the total debt of the empire to 1.531 billion florins. In the end, the Austrian Imperial government only approved a disaster relief budget of 20 million florins, and required the Hungarian local government to allocate at least 10 million florins for disaster relief. The intensity of disaster relief at this time was much stronger than at the same time in history. However, when Count Zhny returned to Hungary in a hurry, it was devastated. Instead of repairing the damaged houses, they were violently demolished. Countless men, women, children, and the elderly had to leave their homes because their land was confiscated. Because they could not pay taxes, the expropriated land will be turned into new farms or recreational hunting grounds. Everywhere you look, there are displaced victims wandering aimlessly on the Hungarian plain. Some kind-hearted factory owners were recruiting indentured slaves, and many victims were beaten to death in order to qualify for an indentured slave. Occasionally, a few luxurious carriages with escorts would stop on the roadside, announcing that a certain noble wanted to adopt children. In fact, most of those nobles were just here to have fun, or to find boys and girls to satisfy their special hobbies. Zhny was well aware of the shady business involved, and some human traffickers were also involved in sourcing goods for the brothels. He sat in the center of the carriage and asked the butler beside him, how many more people can be accommodated in the home? The old housekeeper had watched Zhny grow up and knew that the young master was kind-hearted, so he said more, because he knew that a considerable number of the victims would not be able to reach Zhny's manor, and some would die on the way, People will run away because they miss their family and homeland. There are already enough workers in the manor, but if the young master wants to feed more people, or 1,000 people should be no problem. We still have 30,000 florins in coins, but we can use the expected notes when we get to Budapest, so it won't be a big problem. The common people of Hungary did not recognize the Austrian banknotes, but the coinage was the universal currency. There were 7 carriages in Zhny's motorcade. Except for 2 carriages, they were for people to ride on. The last 5 carriages were all for salutes. Zhny and the old housekeeper sat in the first carriage, and in the second carriage, there were 4 servants responsible for taking care of Zhny's daily life, and they were accompanied by a 40-man escort. The huge team suddenly stopped, and a knight came to Zhny's car. The steward briefly explained a few words to the former under the gaze of the people around him. The knight shouted loudly, Count Zhny's family is looking for a long-term worker, 300 florins a year. Zhny's family is very famous in Hungary, and his father is a famous philanthropist. With 300 florins a year, it is simply a dream job for an ordinary Hungarian. The old housekeeper also felt that it was too high, but Zhny's reason was that all the long-term workers in his manor were 300 florins, and the victims could not be made to feel that they were being discriminated against. The old housekeeper could only shake his head helplessly. This young master was very smart and good at making money, but all his money was given to others. If this continues, sooner or later the family fortune left by the master will be wiped out by him. Fortunately, the long-term workers in the manor saved a sum of money for him, hoping that the money would not be used one day. The quota of 1,000 people was quickly filled. Later, several knights purchased 30,000 florins of food nearby and distributed it to the victims, but it was still a drop in the bucket. Soon Count Zhni arrived at the Hungarian Parliament Hall, which was full of well-dressed nobles. They smoked cigars shipped from across the ocean and drank expensive wine. The atmosphere in the hall was very warm, as if they had just won a battle. War in general. Look, our hero is back. Welcome to the victory, my dear Count Zhni. This is another great victory for the Hungarian nation over the Austrian Empire. Speaker Count Pillar warmly embraced Zhni. While the hall there was thunderous applause inside. Zhni was a little confused. There were already people dying of hunger outside. It was obvious that the disaster relief efforts were not enough. There was nothing to be happy about. He should obviously be sad. My friend, thanks to you, not only did the Austrians give us 20 million florins, but we also allowed us to pay 10 million florins less in taxes. You are really a hero of Hungary. Now the Hungarian parliament has decided, confer upon you the Order of St. Stephen's crown, the highest honor in the Kingdom of Hungary. Count Pillar put the gold medal inlaid with diamonds on Count Zhni's chest and hung a ribbon for him. But there are countless victims outside waiting for relief. This money should be used. Count Zhni wanted to say something. What else can we save? Is there ever a flood that doesn't kill anyone? If you want to save us. My hunting ground is flooded, and now I can't find a single deer. My son has no choice but to go to the brothel. Count Zhni, this time our family will get at least 1 million florins. You are going to treat me to dinner tonight. A group of nobles were chattering away. Zhni looked at the hopeless people in front of him indifferently and walked up to the podium. As Count Zhni took the stage, everything fell silent. After all, Count Zhni is now a very popular figure in Hungary. Although he is a bit deviant, he has done a lot of practical things for Hungary. When it comes to paying taxes, Zhni can be said to be number one in Hungary. After all, Hungarian nobles have tax-free privileges, and every transaction between Count Zhni and the Habsburg royal family is reported truthfully, and taxes are paid truthfully. You must know that it is millions of dollars in taxes. If it were anyone else, they would still find a way to keep the money, even if they had to fight for their lives. This is not a victory for the Hungarian nation, but a tragedy for our nation. A group of elites abandoned hundreds of thousands of Hungarian compatriots for their own selfish desires. Is this what you call a victory? Why is there this severe flood? Weren't you the ones who prevented the construction of the Danube Dam? If the Austrian Imperial government and the Emperor of the Habsburg family know that we have embezzled disaster relief funds, who will help the victims next time? I'm not a hero of Hungary, I'm a sinner of Hungary. If you are a conscientious Hungarian, please extend your helping hand to save those who are experiencing suffering. I do not accept this medal, I do not deserve it. After Count Zhni finished speaking, he took off the medal from his chest, slapped it heavily on the table, and walked toward the door of the venue alone. Don't worry, Count Zhni, come back. The Emperor of the Habsburg family is a fool. There was a burst of laughter behind him, and Count Zhni left the venue without looking back. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.